I will be your shield in the fiercest battle. I'll defend you from all these arrows, and the sword I will keep you from danger. Let me be your shield.
We have you go for orbit here. Go for orbit.
The pilot observes the earth below and the heavens beyond the horizon.
It's just you, me, and the odds. We stuck together, we two peas in a pod. You dealt a bad hand, I'm there seizing the cards. We'll never be separated till we see in the gods. We've been low together, high forever. Long as we go together, we'll die whenever. Be a light, couldn't let the darkness try you ever. Truth in my word, you I lie to never. And when the world gets a little too hard, wipe your eyes, put away your sorrow. When it's war, I'll be leading the charge, and I'll be still fighting for you tomorrow. Yeah, even with a blindfold or in different time zones, could find my way to you with my eyes closed. There's nothing between us. Go to Mars and Venus, stand in front of every one of them rocks they slinging and be your shield.
Your shield in the fiercest battle. I'll defend you.
I can see Florida,
From all these arrows, and the sword I will keep you from danger. Let me be your shield.
Let's go. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your.
For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Honor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. Why? Why must man go into space?
You may be facing tribulation, but don't let it get you down. What I'm saying may take patience, but you're gonna make it out. I scratch my own 2 feet to pull you to safety. When the fires are burning, burning like crazy. Carnage around us, but you won't feel no pain. I will take your place, I will be.
Thus saith the Lord God, I will also destroy the idols, and I will cause their images to cease.
In the fiercest battle, I'll defend you. From all these arrows, and the sword I will keep you from danger. Let me be your shield.
Let's go. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your shield. Let me be your shield, let me be your.
The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusted in him, and I am helped. Therefore my heart greatly rejoiceth, and with my song will I praise him.
Well, hello and welcome to Idol Killer. We are doing a, what do you call this? A watch party? I've never done one of these before. And you know what? We're not going to be alone tonight, you guys. Oh, hey, Cecil. Hey, everybody's a critic. Everybody's a critic, man. I think you're the first person to criticize my intros. So I think you get an award. But hey, we're not going to be alone tonight. We're going to be joined by none other than Mr. Provisionism himself, Leighton Flowers. Hey, Leighton, welcome to Idol Killer, sir.
Hello, hello. I am in Texas heat watching my son play football out in Garland, Texas. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Do Texans play football? Is that?
Yeah.
Do they play football out there?
Yeah, just a little bit, just a little bit.
Yeah, they take it quite serious.
Between eating barbecue, you know, when we stop eating barbecue, then we play football, and then we go back to eating barbecue again. That's about it.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, tonight we're going to be, and I see the countdown for the debate has started. So tonight we're going to be watching this debate. For everybody kind of tuning in, we're going to be watching Kurt Jaros debating Turretin Fan on whether or not Provisionism is semi-Pelagian. It's going to be I think a fun debate. Turretin Fan is very what's the word I'm looking for? Gentlemanly, very kind. He's very strong in his convictions and beliefs, and Kurt is very knowledgeable and equally skilled and knowledgeable here. So I think this is going to be a fun debate. I think it's going to come down to the way that Pelagianism is defined. I think it's really going to come down to terms as to how they're going to define this as to whether or not it's semi-Pelagian. I mean, I think we mentioned yesterday on your program, Leighton, that they were condemning Zwingli of being, or was Zwingli condemning Beza, or was Beza condemning? But they were fighting amongst themselves. One was condemning the other as semi-Pelagian. So I'm gee, dope. Grace Mercy Rad says, "Idol Killer, you're platforming Dr. Flowers."
Well, you will platform anybody, man.
I will platform anybody. That's right, man. As long as you got the goldfish and you put them in your own heels, I'll do that.
Yeah, it was Luther. It was Luther that was accusing Zwingli of being Pelagian because he didn't hold to the same view.
Yeah, it was Luther. Luther was attacking Zwingli. That's right. Yeah. So this is gonna be fun. Does Pelagianism? Let's see. What does this say? Does Pelagianism hold anti-baptismal regeneration? Anti-baptismal regeneration. Oh, okay. Yeah. Again, Fishy, you're going to come down to definitions. It'll be interesting. I mean, I'm on Kurt's corner here. I'm definitely leaning in favor of him. I see Marlon is doing his 15-minute introductions. He'll be introducing some other debates and everything that he's got coming up there. And I'm going to unmute this when the debate starts, and we'll just be chiming in with our own 2 cents from time to time. And we may have a few extra guests popping in. We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, let me go ahead and just check the levels here and see how this is. There we go.
Warren, I can't imagine a better way of spending an evening, even though it's 108 degrees out here. Theology geeking out while watching Texas high school football. I mean, I've kind of hit the well, if the weather was nice, it would be the trifecta, because it would be great weather, great football, and a great discussion all at once. I just got the double effect of whatever that's called. And without I need a little cooler weather. That's all I need.
Yeah, I remember growing up in Texas and jumping on my bicycle as a kid, and from 5th grade all the way up to junior high, and bicycling up to the high school football field. And I wasn't so much into football as much as I was the cheerleaders, though. So my friends and I would go, and we would get the world's worst nachos, and then we would just sit and watch the cheerleaders. I could not have told you anything about the game, but I could have told you every one of those cheerleaders' names.
Now you made me hungry for nachos. Here we go. I'm trying to watch my figure. Come on, man.
Yeah, no, you're doing great, man. You're doing great. I need to get some diet tips from you, because I've been going mainly carnivore.
Oh, hey, I figured it out, dude. Here's the secret. It's only on your show I'm releasing this, so here's the secret. Eat less food. That's it. There's nothing more. Yeah, that's it. Just eat less food.
Just
Yeah.
eat less food.
Yeah, that's it. The diet secret of all diet secrets. It didn't cost you a dime.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's like I started going on carnivore and going mostly meat. I still will eat some. Oh wait, here we go. I'm a cheerleader guy too. Well, not anymore. I'm married now. I think we all are at heart.
You do what I did and just marry a cheerleader, and then get the best of both worlds.
Well, if there are any cheerleaders watching, they can send their applications to victory@idolkiller.com, and I am screening applications. And see, now I'm not in Texas, but I do have a big old glass of tea, so I'm there with you in spirit. All right, so it looks like they're getting started.
Oh, Kurt looks good. He's not so close to the camera that, his face looks like it's engulfing the entire screen like the Turton film is. Is Turton? That's not his real name. Does he just go by that moniker all the time? Does nobody ever used his real name?
Yeah, I think that's kind of his channel name, kind of like I'm Idol Killer or your Soteriology 101. I think he's just Turton fan. I don't know his real name.
I think I asked for it a while back, and he just doesn't give it. Like he keeps it secret.
Yeah, there must be something in his past, witness protection program or something like that he doesn't want people to know about.
Well, I can't hear them. Are they talking? Because I can't hear them if they are.
What's that?
I can't hear them talking if they're talking.
Yeah, I'm going to turn the volume up.
I'm still not hearing anything. I don't know. Is your audience hearing it?
Yeah, can y'all hear it? We can hear the whistles in the background.
Well, I'm talking about Turton fan. I see him talking, but I can't hear him talking.
It says no audio. Okay.
This debate.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you so much once again for joining me. All right, Kurt, you got it, man. Go ahead, tell them what you do, man.
Yeah, I wear a few hats. I'm the executive director of Defenders Media 501c3. We do media marketing for apologists and evangelists, New Testament scholars, theologians. I'm also the part-time director of marketing for Ratio Christi College Campus Ministry, but I do my theology and apologetics writing, speaking, teaching through Veracity Hill. And then finally, I'm also an affiliate faculty member at Colorado Christian University at the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. So a number of hats keep me busy, but I feel blessed to be doing my work and getting paid for it through doing theology and apologetics.
All right. Good stuff, guys. Excellent. So everyone in the chat, make sure you guys go check them out. See what they do. All right, we're going to jump to this debate. The topic is Provisionism, semi-Pelagianism? Turton fan, you're arguing affirmative. Dr. Kurt, you're arguing negative. So we're going to start that with 10-minute opening statements. We're going to follow that with 5-minute rebuttals. Then we're going to have a 40-minute cross-section with both parties. You get 20 minutes each to lead with questions. And we're going to follow that with 5-minute closings. And then we're going to have a 30-minute Q&A from the audience. Sounds good?
Sounds great.
All right. Kurt, you are arguing affirmative, so you'll be up first. Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. Turton fan, you are arguing affirmative, so you are going to be up first. You should have seen Kurt.
I was like, deja vu.
Stunned, like what? No. All right, Turton fan, you're up first, man. You got the stage, man. I'll give you time to station, and then when you begin to speak, I'll start your time.
Thanks so much. First off, let's see where we're going. First, I'm going to define what semi-Pelagian and Provisionism mean. Then I'll evaluate two aspects of Provisionism with respect to the semi-Pelagian spectrum. And finally, I'll judge Provisionism according to two canons of two of the relevant church councils. First of all, some background definition. The fall resulted in the spiritual death of man. After the fall, by nature, man is incapable of humility, repentance, faith, or any other right action or attitude toward God. Accordingly, it is only by God's grace that man does anything good. This biblical position was advocated by Augustine in the beginning of the 5th century against a contrary position attributed to Pelagius and Celestius. They were accused of teaching that man's nature is unchanged.
I have a real hard time
and that
following
mankind is able to do
a
good
verbal
with his own
debate
accord.
with text on the
He that
screen.
says man's nature
I
is
always
love
find that
and
it's very
grace is
distracting.
needed to do what's right.
I don't know if anybody else
Pelagianism.
wrestles with that, but I
He that
noticed
says
that like
man's
when
nature
there's
is
slides on
dead,
the
and that any good
screen,
thing
it
that man
causes me
does
issues
is
in
by
following
God's
the debate.
grace is called Augustinianism. Each of these views has various outworkings as to the nature of free will, the guilt of Adam's sin, the atonement, God's knowledge, predestination, sanctification, and merit in the Christian life. The battle between these two positions was seemingly short-lived. The Council of Carthage of 418 condemned various aspects of the Pelagian doctrines with a set of canons, and those canons seem to have been widely accepted throughout the ancient church. Nevertheless, the canons only condemned Pelagianism, but did not at the same time fully teach Augustinianism. Thus, there was left some room for a middle way between Augustinianism and Pelagianism. This leads us to, as the name implies, semi-Pelagianism
As if
is a system of
Augustinianism
beliefs
is that
between
simple to
Pelagianism
understand.
and Augustinianism. Sorry about that.
What was it? What was that, Leighton?
I would just say as if Augustinianism is all that cut and dry. I mean, which part of Augustinian's teaching? His early teachings, his late teachings? He wasn't consistent in his views. So what do you mean by Augustinianism?
Yeah, I mean, we had that quote from him we played on your program last night where he was very clear in defending free will. He would have been a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian based off that statement.
The teaching that man's nature is somehow sick but not dead lies between the Pelagian view that man's nature is unharmed and the Augustinian position that it is dead. This is one of the classic examples of semi-Pelagian anthropology. Provisionism. I'm defining provisionism in terms of the PROVIDE acronym promoted by Dr. Leighton Flowers and his Soteriology 101 efforts. This is a group that came out of the traditional Baptist statement group, and in some ways I think that its views are a little bit different. There are some ambiguities in the PROVIDE acronym and its graphic that's provided, and so for interpretation of provisionism's beliefs, I'm turning to the media provided by Soteriology 101, including its tweets, web postings at Soteriology 101, and that kind of thing. There's also a YouTube channel as well. Because time's limited, I'll focus on two of the most central aspects of the Augustinian-Pelagian divide, anthropology and grace. Provisionism is semi-Pelagian on the nature of man. When we come back to the semi-Pelagian anthropology mentioned above, we see that Flowers unambiguously opposes the Augustinian position that mankind is born with a moral inability to respond willingly, as in his Born Dead article and his The Walking Dead, Man's Fallen Condition article. More specifically, the key point of the Augustinian position that Flowers objects to is this. This is a quotation from him. He says, the key point in this statement, quoting some Reformed literature, is the sentence that reads, and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. As to dead in sin, Flowers compares the fallen man to the prodigal son rather than to Lazarus. As to by his own strength, Flowers only acknowledges that our natural strength is from God. As to convert himself, Flowers compares the situation to a person not being able to perform a heart surgery on themselves, but being able to submit to the doctor's will to perform that surgery. As to prepare himself thereunto, Flowers refers to the truth of God's word as the sufficient preparation for conversion. At the same time, the PROVIDE acronym implies, and the judicial statement affirms, that every person who is capable of moral action will sin, and that because of the fall of Adam, every person inherits a nature and environment inclined toward sin. Thus, Flowers seems to fall short of the pure Pelagian extreme that says some people never sin, or that there's no effect on human nature from the fall.
I don't think Pelagius ever taught that.
Provisionism is also semi-Pelagian on grace.
What was that, Leighton?
Issue is the issue of grace.
I was just saying, I don't think Pelagius ever taught that either, like we've already discussed, but that's neither here nor there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we're going to define Pelagianism not based around what Augustine claimed Pelagius believed or what Pelagius's teachings asserted he believed. It's more of a weaponized club, and whoever's wielding it gets to define it. It seems
irresistible grace, and calls the Arminian position of prevenient grace, which states that grace comes before and enables these things, doesn't intrinsically.
Thank you for the super chat, Aaron. So he says, first they need to establish that they're not talking about semi-Pelagianism as in what Pelagius actually believed, but rather the definition Augustine and his followers assigned. And I agree with that. They need to go through the 14 points of Pelagianism and say which one of these and how many of these make one semi.
And imagine our world where I get to define what whiteism is, James White believes is. And I get to define what they are. He can deny them all day long, but I get to be the one that defines what whiteism is. And everybody has to go along with it from this forth. So 2,000 years from now, everybody has to define whiteism the way Leighton Flowers defines it. Imagine that. Nobody would want to accept that. On either side, by the way, no one wanted. That's exactly what's happened to Pelagius.
Yeah. Yep. Aaron's got another chat here. Thank you for that, Aaron. He says semi-Pelagianism is biblical, so the debate question then becomes: is provisionism biblical? Well, I mean, again, Aaron, it's going to come down to what you're using to define semi-Pelagianism. I mean, we could say, provisionism is early Augustinian or semi-Augustine. So, it depends on who's wielding it and weaponizing it and defining it, and that's really where I think Turretin is bringing this up now.
Bayes' definition essentially aligns with my own, and out of about 5 or so errors that Bayes identifies, Flowers would agree with Bayes' opponents on 4. And I'm confident that Bayes would agree with my use of his label for Flowers. The label was also used by the
I already
Lutheran
admitted that
Community
yesterday,
of
remember?
Concord
Bayes
and
would definitely consider me a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian. We all know that.
Yeah.
That's a given.
Beza, not the most charitable individual.
Around the same time, the label was also used by Roman Catholic opponents of Louis de Molina. While Flowers is not, as far as I know, a Molinist, it's reasonable to conclude that Provisionism is closer to Pelagianism than Molinism is. So if the Roman Catholic definition is the one to go with, then it seems Flowers is farther towards the Pelagian end of the spectrum. The same is true of the functional definition of the term used in various systematic theologies among Reformed theologians in the centuries following Bayes' introduction of the term into the theological vocabulary. Flowers' position falls within the bounds of most, but perhaps not all, of the standard usage of the term. But what about the anachronistic historical definition? That leaves us.
Sam asks, why does he keep talking about Flowers? But the issue is that Leighton has identified traditionalism with the provide acrostic. And so, Leighton, we were talking about this yesterday. I mean, like if Beza defines semi-Pelagianism, he would be the guy to go to say, what does that mean? If you're defining provisionism, you'd be the guy to go to say, what does that mean? And so I think that's why Turretin is trying to quote you as much as possible to kind of box and frame and build his arguments as he moves forward. And I think he's doing that partly just to better lock down the definitions and the terms and try and identify what the provisionist view is that he's trying to identify as semi-Pelagian. So I think that's just a debate tactic.
Well, the song keeps running through my head. You're so vain, you probably think this debate is about you.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, really, the debate could be is Leighton Flowers a semi-Pelagian? That's right.
And historically, provisionism is semi-Pelagian.
All right, thank you, Turretin, for that presentation. And now, Kurt, you're up for your opening statement. And I'll allow you time to get your presentation up, and we'll go for it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I apologize. I realized I was unmuted the whole time, so people may have heard me shuffling papers. And so my apology.
You were transitioned off the screen, so all that goes mute when you're not in the screen, so you're good.
Excellent, thank you. Excellent work there. All right, let's see if I get this PowerPoint up and running. If I do it the right way.
There you go.
That looks clear?
Looks clear.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank Marlon for the invitation to speak at this digital event and for Turretin Fan for agreeing to participate. Turretin Fan is the persona that my Christian brother goes by, but for convenience as the evening goes on, I will refer to him as Frank. The subject of tonight's debate is Provisionism semi-Pelagianism? The subject is not, is Provisionism biblical or true, or is semi-Pelagianism biblical or true? So tonight, I'm not asking my Christian brothers and sisters to reconsider their biblical interpretation. Tonight, I'm asking them to reconsider how the term semi-Pelagian has been used in theological discussions. Another caveat I'd like to state up front is that while I have some sympathies to the views of provisionists, I don't consider myself one due to some disagreements over their positions and even the aforementioned ambiguities of the provide acrostic. In denying that provisionism is semi-Pelagianism, one must first provide definitions to these terms. I suspect that Frank and I will have some conversation about these terms, what they mean, and the related subject matter. I watched a number of Frank's prepisodes, as he called them, and while I'm discussing this issue with him for the first time, I already perceived good camaraderie from watching this video, and I hope we'll have a rest of this enjoyable debate. Provisionism is a newer movement that was birthed out of Southern Baptist traditionalism. There is a history to be explained there, but I won't use my time to explain that history. Provisionism is best defined using the provide acrostic. This is an acrostic found at soteriology101.com and was used by Leighton Flowers, the most well-known representative and self-described popularizer, in a video 4 years ago called What is Provisionism? And we'll review this now. So people sin, which separates all from fellowship with God. Therefore, divine provision became necessary. Responsible, that is, everyone is able to respond to God's appeals for reconciliation because a divine provision will be heard and understood. Open door is the divine provision offered impartially to all for anyone to enter through faith or whoever may come to his open arms. Vicarious atonement is the divine provision given of sufficient value for the sins of the whole world and provide a way for anyone to be saved on the basis of Christ's shed blood. Illuminating grace, pay attention to this one. Illuminating grace is the divine provision offered sufficiently to all and provides clearly revealed truth so that all can know and respond in faith. Destroyed for unbelief and resisting the Holy Spirit's drawing to God's mercy will be the divine provision of justice. And finally, eternal security is the divine provision that is everlasting for all true believers. That's provisionism. Now, what is semi-Pelagianism? And here we have some definitions, as my title flies in after the content. While not denying the necessity of grace for salvation, the semi-Pelagianism holds that and is maintained that the first steps toward the Christian life were ordinarily taken by the human will and that grace supervened only later. So this is an important definition, and I'll also follow that up with the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, which holds something akin to this, that the unaided will performed the initial act of faith. So these two definitions or descriptions are largely systematic in nature, and I know we'll perhaps get into the historical discussion of the term, but these are from the scope and framework of systematic theology. This is what systematicians refer to as semi-Pelagianism. I have three main arguments for believing that provisionism is not semi-Pelagianism. Argument number one, doctrinal differences. Provisionism appears to hold positions which are at odds against semi-Pelagianism on the necessity of grace, election, and justification. Let's look at the necessity of grace. According to common systematic descriptions, semi-Pelagianism is the position that humans can take the first steps of salvation devoid of grace. Provisionism, on the other hand, holds that divine grace precedes the human decision. Divine grace precedes the human decision in a number of ways, from the divine work in Historia Salutis and the atoning work of Christ, to the individual occasions of the preaching, hearing, and reading of the gospel. The I in provide holds illuminating grace is the divine provision offered sufficiently to all and provides clearly revealed truth so that all can know and respond in faith. Without that illuminating grace, the truth would not be revealed to persons, and so is a prerequisite for the choice of the will. even on a narrower view that provisionism is identical to Southern Baptist traditionalism, Articles 2 and 8 explicitly describe the Holy Spirit's drawing and calling a necessary condition. And furthermore, I think it's Article 4, which talks about the grace of God being necessary and complete in its, here it is. We affirm the grace of God's generous decision to provide salvation for any person by taking all of the initiative in providing atonement. That's Article 4 of the traditional statement. But let's suppose that you're not persuaded by this and that these graces described are external grace, not internal grace. Well, there are three reasons there. You can see the lowercase a, b, and c for thinking why this is misguided. First, external grace's effect is an internal result. External grace's effect is an internal result. Second, God is the formal cause of the human will, and thus his grace is necessary for making the will what it is. Faustus of Ries referred to this grace as the prima gratia. Third, nothing precludes provisionism from embracing a concurrent model of divine grace. By concurrence, I mean that when the human makes a free will choice, that is the grace of God working. R.J. Matava describes it as God concurs in the action of the human agent to bring about a certain effect, such that there is but one action and one effect, even though there are two agents. So for these three reasons, I think provisionism avoids the charge of semi-Pelagianism on the subject of nature and grace. But let's consider election. It appears that Leighton Flowers holds to a corporate election model of predestination. In his video, What is Provisionism? Within the 20-minute mark, he defines predestination as, by predestination, we mean the predetermined redemptive plan of God to justify, sanctify, and glorify whosoever freely believes. All people are created with equal value as image bearers of God. He continues on, but for our purposes, we can contrast this corporate election model against the alleged semi-Pelagians of the 5th century in Roman Gaul, who held to something far closer to classical Arminian view of individual election. Lastly, let's look at justification. Recall that for semi-Pelagianism, it's alleged that the human will is unaided in its choice to accept the gospel, but that divine grace comes later. Divine grace attending later describes not only the process of sanctification, but in justification as well. For some accused of semi-Pelagianism, the concern was over faith plus works righteousness in order to be justified. Provisionism, as a subset of Protestantism, holds to sola fide, that an individual is justified before God by faith alone, and that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to believers. And so we see there again with Article 4 of the traditional statement, that it's God's generous decision to provide salvation for any person by taking all the initiative. So for the provisionist, Christ's atoning work on the cross is all that's needed, nothing else. And salvation is a gift for the believers. There's no work that has to be done. Not so for the alleged semi-Pelagians. For the Gallic monks, it was a different view. And for even Augustine himself, it was a different view. He devotes chapters 18 through 21 of On Grace and Free Will to faith plus works as necessary for salvation. Let's briefly consider the historical anachronisms. When we look at the Gallic monks of the 5th century, we see that there were no semi-Pelagians in 5th century Roman Gaul. Now, that might be surprising to many of you. I spent 5 years of my life studying the Gallic monks, John Cassian, Vincent of Lorenz, and Faustus of Ries. But when we analyze their views of grace, we see that they held to the necessity of grace. Here's Cassian. The origin not only of good acts, but even of good work, good thoughts is in God. He both inspires us the beginnings of a holy will and grants the ability and the opportunity to bring to fulfillment the things that we rightly desire. There is plenty more. I'll skip a few quotes here. We can review these later. But we can even look at Augustine himself, who says this: of those brethren of ours, men's wills are anticipated by God's grace. This is what they hold. Men's wills are anticipated by God's grace, and to the agreement that no one can suffice for himself, either for beginning or for completing any good work. So even Augustine himself admits that the Gallic monks held to the necessity of grace. They were not semi-Pelagians. Okay, the term was used pejoratively and originating in the 16th century to describe one's contemporary ideological opponents. I think we'll get into that in cross-examination. And moving along, finally, my third argument is that it's a useless terminology. It doesn't serve much purpose. It's a pejorative in origin. It'd be like creating a category called semi-Nestorianism. There are no semi-Pelagians around, because when everybody's a semi-Pelagian, then nobody is a semi-Pelagian. So here's a nice Toy Story meme where if everybody, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, American Evangelicals, traditional Southern
All
Baptists,
right, Kurt,
Calvinists,
that's
Church
time
Fathers,
right there.
if everyone is a semi-Pelagian, then no
Kurt,
one is.
Kurt, that's time right there. All right,
Great.
thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Twitter fan, for those opening statements. Now we're going to transition to our rebuttal rounds, which are 5-minute rebuttals. And so, Twitter fan, you're back in the seat, and I will start your time.
As we discussed, it's going to come down to definitions.
Thanks so much. It's great to have the opportunity to respond. In terms of the definition of semi-Pelagianism, the concise Oxford Dictionary or the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology are not unreasonable places to begin with a discussion of the meaning. But of course, in the very cursory way in which they define semi-Pelagianism, it leaves open a lot of question about what's intended by the definition provided. For example, in the first of those definitions, the definition states, while not denying the necessity of grace for salvation, so Leighton Flowers' position doesn't deny the necessity of grace for salvation, as we heard. It maintains that the first steps toward the Christian life were ordinarily taken by the human will, and that grace supervened only later. So the question is, what does that statement imply? And the answer is that it implies
That's not your position, that men take the first step. I mean, that's
no, it's the opposite.
Yeah,
We're responders. I can't tell you how many times we say we're responders.
With this definition of semi-Pelagianism, the Arminians are excluded from the definition of semi-Pelagianism, but Leighton Flowers is included because he thinks that people can, just by hearing the gospel message and having their natural capabilities of being able to believe things that are true, that they can believe the gospel, that they don't need
hearing the gospel message is not man taking the first step. We've been given the gospel message by God. That is not the first step coming from man.
Similarly, when it says in the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, an unaided will performed the initial act of faith. Of course, the question is, does anyone think that this evangelical
is they skip all the steps of the atonement, all the steps of God's revelation, all those steps have to be skipped. And the first step is the step of response of man. And that's what they're starting with. That's the first step in their mind. But they're skipping all the other steps that God did before that. Why?
The gospel
to be effective in their argumentation, not necessarily to represent the facts.
We're not including general revelation. We're not including the gospel. We're talking about unaided by a work of God's supernatural grace in the person's heart. And that's a view that Leighton Flowers explicitly mocks and rejects. As for doctrinal differences between semi-Pelagianism and Provisionism that are alleged here, the first one was this idea of illuminating grace, meaning the gospel message itself or general revelation. But again, those are excluded from the category of grace that we're talking about when we're talking about
why
issues.
Why are they excluded? Who gets to exclude those categories of grace?
Even if it's not explicitly in those dictionary definitions.
I'm shouting at a football stadium about grace.
As far as the question of whether there's a causality inwardly from these outward things, certainly Leighton Flowers doesn't believe that people are caused in an Augustinian sense to believe. Maybe has some other sense of in which people are caused to believe. But keep in mind as well that according to Leighton Flowers, people who haven't heard the gospel preached can still act and can still then receive the gospel as a blessing from God for what they did, a great response that God provides to these people based on something they did before they ever heard the gospel. As for the concurrent divine grace being something that's a possible view, of course, the question is not whether it's a possible view. Of course, the question is whether or not it's something that Leighton actually teaches. I'm not aware of him teaching it. seems as though he might be willing to say that our very life and existence comes from God. But again, that's just nature again. We're not talking anymore about grace that produces an effect in a person, such as in
What is nature?
Arminianism,
What is
prevenient grace.
nature? Mother Nature? Are we talking about Mother Nature here? What is nature? What are we talking about? We're talking about how God created us? Is that what we're talking about?
Yep, sounds
God
like he's going to
graciously-
anthropology right there, and how
God
we're created.
graciously, yeah, I mean, God graciously creates us with a will, and he graciously illuminates light and truth and sends Jesus for us. Those are all graces. Yeah.
Well, see, if you affirm that God was gracious when he created us, then you're denying his grace later. So you're denying that he was gracious. It seems to be silly.
As it's not necessarily essential to this particular debate.
All right. Thank you for that rebuttal. And Kurt, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. And I'll start your time as soon as you begin to speak.
Thank you for that response, Frank. Just a quick refresher. In my opener, I presented 3 arguments looking at doctrinal differences between Provisionism and semi-Pelagianism, considering historical anachronisms, and then also sharing that it's a useless terminology because it's so broad and vague. And I want to start by actually illustrating how it's broad and vague. In Frank's definition of semi-Pelagian in his opening speech, he described it as a system of beliefs that lies between an Augustinian system and a Pelagianist system. He gave 2 perhaps sub-definitions. We'll look at that in cross-examination. A system that includes some, but not substantially all of the Pelagian errors, or a system that includes errors that are in the direction of Pelagianism, but which do not go to the Pelagian extreme. So if it simply is defined as going in the direction of Pelagianism, then this means that if you are 1% Pelagian, that you are semi-Pelagian. Well, I don't know how or why we should think that if you're 1% or 10% or 35 or 50%, what constitutes as semi-Pelagianism precisely? Does this mean that James White, a Reformed Baptist who believes in, rejects paedobaptism, is a Pelagian or a semi-Pelagian? Right?
Exactly.
That would
why
be a really strange definition for semi-Pelagianism.
Yep.
And then it really opens up even broader about who qualifies as a semi-Pelagian. But secondly, why should we call persons going in one direction toward Pelagianism as semi-Pelagians and not, say, semi-Augustinians? And this is one of the positions of the scholars who write on the Gallic monks. Some prefer to call them semi-Augustinians. The Gallic monks themselves never would have taken that label semi-Pelagian, a label which occurs 1,000 years after they existed. All right, I want to address a few other things. Looking at the title slide of Frank's opener, he sort of reframed the question, is Provisionism semi-Pelagian? That is an important distinction because that's an adjective. Is it semi-Pelagian? The question of tonight's debate is Provisionism semi-Pelagianism? And is far more, as a noun, a question of identity. And so that's a much harder question. And
yeah, that's a good point. That's
something
a really
that
good
I'm
point.
not sure that Frank addresses. Next, I want to consider how Frank has identified Provisionism as the beliefs of Leighton Flowers, whether it's an article, maybe a tweet Leighton has put out. And while Leighton is free to say and write and publish as he wants, I think that Provisionism is broader than merely the beliefs of Leighton Flowers, and that we should look at the provide acrostic as our metric, as our measure. It's wholly plausible that Leighton Flowers, a self-identified popularizer, could say something that is, frankly, full-out Pelagian, and that would preclude him from being a semi-Pelagian, but he'd be a full Pelagian. And so that's why I think it's a little tricky to depend on, something that Leighton himself might say. Now, the I of the provide acrostic is far broader than Frank is giving credit here. The illuminating grace, the I, that description doesn't say whether it's external or internal grace. And he's only depending upon Leighton and what Leighton has said for external grace. Now, again, I'll repeat the points I said in my opener. If you think that's external grace, well, external grace still has an internal effect. And so God may work in the world in such a way that the external graces are in effect, both an E and an A of internal grace. Now, that might separate Leighton from other provisionists But again, that doesn't mean that Leighton's views are representative of all of provisionism. And in fact, I think Frank, in one of his prepisodes, admitted as much, that the traditional statement, Leighton and the traditional statement, are a subset of provisionism. It is a broader camp than the camp from which it was born, the traditional Southern Baptists. So we've looked at semi-Pelagianism as a definition that's far too broad, where anyone can be semi-Pelagian. Last, I want to look at the dictionary definitions. So Frank just said that the language of those dictionaries might not be that clear. And so something close to that. That's really important, because as a made-up term, there has to be further refinement about what people believe. And so this continues to demonstrate the amorphous scope of what semi-Pelagianism is. And for that reason, I still think the term is useless, and we'll probably get more into that in cross-examination.
All right, guys. Thank you both for those openings and rebuttals.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
so now we are going
he
to
made some
transition
really great
to
points
our
there regarding grace,
cross-examination.
regarding
Once
the
again, this will be a friendly
provide,
cross-text.
and
Both
then
of you
regarding
join us. You
the
should lead with questions.
amorphous,
We
meaningless use of
in
this
that,
term that
if we
really
can
has
make
no
your
firm
question
definition.
as short and concise as possible, and allow your
Yeah, it's like
opponent to
we were
respond
talking
to those
about last
questions in a
night.
fair
It's like
manner.
calling,
It would be greatly
is Trump
appreciated, because it would be
conservative?
beneficial for you guys.
Well, you base it
audience,
on
and
his
also
picking
make
of
sure as
justices,
comments,
then
one time I
yes.
will interrupt, is
Based
I hear
upon
that
his
analyst is if
treatment of
fair
marriage vows,
conversation is very
no. So
Right.
what how do you define conservatism?
that said,
It's a term that's relative to the beholder, and whoever's to the left of you is going to be liberal, or right of you is going to be fundamentalist, or whatever else. But it's just a label.
I guess I'll start with this definition of provisionism as being just limited to the acrostic and not incorporating Leighton's own views. In the acrostic, the P, which says people sin, which separates all from fellowship with God, therefore a divine provision became necessary. Does that include infants who have not personally committed any sins? What's all there include infants?
Yeah, well, we might get into this, Frank, but you had mentioned you had problems with ambiguities with the provide acrostic. I too have problems with those ambiguities, and we might have some agreement. Furthermore, the way that this is worded, and I wasn't a part of this at all, I don't identify as a provisionist. Some of these points are points that Calvinists, I mean, even Calvinists can agree. People sin, which separates all from the fellowship with God. Therefore, divine provision became necessary. Calvinists can agree with that. So, if you're asking what provisionists believe, I would perhaps say that there's a spectrum here, at least logically, as far as the acrostic is concerned. It's
Just like there's
so
a spectrum
broad.
of Calvinists that have
And
different
in that
views
sense,
on
I
that
don't know that
point.
it's a helpful term to distinguish between the views of some provisionists from Calvinists or Arminians.
So how would we know what this means, if it means anything at all?
Well, I think that we would say it means something very broad, that sin separates us from fellowship with God, and the necessity for the divine provision. I would go further, necessity of the atonement. So I just think it's so broad, and there might be a case to be made that it needs refining, or unless it's intentionally broad. I don't know, and to be honest, I haven't studied the history of the formulation of the provisionist movement enough to know.
So, in many cases, if I read a letter from you, and I wanted to interpret that letter, I might look to the rest of the things I've seen from you to interpret what does that letter mean. Is that a fair way in general of performing hermeneutics?
Yes, that is.
So if this provisionism acrostic is the work of Leighton Flowers, then is it okay to look to Leighton Flowers' work to interpret what does he mean by it?
So I watched this video, What is Provisionism, put out 4 years ago. In that video, Leighton says someone else made this acrostic.
Okay. So
yeah.
Does that mean we have no clue as to how to understand it, or?
Well, we have some idea, and we certainly have some idea what Leighton thinks of it. But if Leighton were to make claims which are narrower than what the acrostic allows, then he's presenting a position that could simply be a subset of provisionists. And if we were to bring in another fellow, Warren McGrew, I think he disagrees with Leighton on a number of issues. First thing that comes to mind is divine foreknowledge, right? So there is a diversity of opinions on theological matters, and I think that even on the provide acrostic, there would be a difference of opinion on how to interpret those things. Like there are intra-Reformed debates and intra-Arminian debates, there are intra-provisionist debates.
So when it comes to the interpretation of the I in provide, which says illuminating grace, what's the reason that my interpretation is any better or worse than your interpretation? Are we just left with a postmodern, everybody's, let's all get some cookies and we're all happy?
Yeah. To be clear, and I'm not quite granting the point, but I'll grant a possible point here. The problem is that this language is too broad. So we don't know exactly what was meant by provides clearly revealed truth. So you have rightly looked at Leighton, and we see that Leighton makes a lot of references about external grace. But my first point is to say that the written language of the I and that the description therein is broader than what Leighton proposes, such that you might think when it says provides clearly revealed truth, that occurs with regard to internal grace, an act of internal grace by God. The I allows for that, as strange as it may be. So that's why, again, it's a broad term, but also, as I had mentioned with my 3 subpoints regarding grace and provisionism, you could still hold to concurrent grace, for example. And you might hold to formal causality. That was the second one, right? That God is the formal cause of our wills. And so that itself is the act of grace that it continues on post-fall. At the end of the day, I think what we are seeing with the dictionary definitions of semi-Pelagianism is really a reformed approach here, and a lack of clarity on terms about super added grace, or some would even call regenerative grace. That's the absence of regenerative grace. But even Arminians disagree with that. Eastern Orthodox disagree with that. So I'm suspect of the definition of semi-Pelagianism, and I'm suspect of the broad nature of provisionism to help us here.
All right. Well, so on the way that you've explained things, if I heard you correctly, it sounds as though if we go back to the people sin in the provisionism acronym, and the only explanation provided there is a list of scripture citations and the statement which separates all from fellowship with God, therefore a divine provision became necessary. Is it reasonable to say that that's broad enough to include semi-Pelagian views as well as a view of original sin?
My intuition says yes, but as I'd mentioned, it's so broad that it could include Calvinists the way that it's written. And so, for that reason, in terms of an issue of identity, it shows that provisionism is not semi-Pelagianism, because you could be a Calvinist and affirm the P, which maybe makes you a semi-provisionist. I don't know. It depends on how many points you've got to affirm to be a semi-provisionist.
So on the R of provide is for this word responsible, which Leighton or whoever drafted this acronym describes in an unusual way. It's not the usual sense of responsible, but it says everyone is able to respond to God's appeal for reconciliation because a divine provision will be heard and understood. Now, the way I understand this is that he means everyone is naturally able to respond. Are you suggesting that this is just so broad that it can include the everyone's naturally able and also can include everyone is supernaturally able?
I wouldn't phrase it quite like that, but you're picking up what I'm putting down here. I mean, for each of the points, I sort of put down different soteriological camps. So the Wesleyan Arminian, who holds to, common grace going out to all, I don't think that a Calvinist could affirm the R. But even Wesleyans would say that everyone is able to respond. And that's because of God's prevenient grace or common grace, depending upon how the type of Arminian defines it. So yeah, I just think it's, in some ways, it's either intentionally broad or it's sloppy language and needs to be refined.
Okay. Now, my take is that this everyone, again, doesn't include infants, because it seems like it would be nonsense to say that everyone here is able to respond to God's appeals.
Again, we're not debating the truth of provisionism.
That's fair that we're not debating the truth. But again, if this everyone in R is interpreted as meaning moral, people who are capable of committing personal individual sins, and that infants are excluded from that, then doesn't it stand to reason that which separates all from fellowship also excludes infants?
Well, as far as the R, if you hold to a post-mortem view, sort of like, post-mortem evangelism, second chance, well, it would be for the infant's first chance, they would, logically speaking, be able to fit under that everyone. Everyone is able to respond to God's appeal. Again, it might depend on the view of the provisionist.
So you think that provisionism is broad enough to incorporate people who don't believe that, or to people who suggest that there's an originist view that there's afterlife further reconciliation?
Yeah, I think it's insanely broad. Calvinists can affirm 3 of the points. Wesleyan Arminians can affirm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think. You have Emeraldian Calvinists that could affirm the V. It's just, I'm not persuaded. One of the reasons why I'm not a provisionist is because I'm not persuaded that this is a helpful acrostic which differentiates the views of at least the most popular provisionists from Calvinism and Arminianism. Again, maybe it was intended to be broad. I don't know. Or it could just be sloppy language.
So turning to that V for vicarious atonement, the explanation given there of sufficient value for the sins, that part seems broad enough to encompass even Calvinists in terms of the sufficient value. But the provides a way for anyone to be saved on the basis of Christ's shed blood. Again, are you interpreting this as so broadly as it would include, without irresistible or in an Arminian sense, prevenient grace, that's also included within the scope of V?
Could you rephrase your question here about how it relates to the provides a way for anyone?
So it says that this atonement is the divine provision, and that it provides a way for anyone to be saved. And you mentioned at the beginning, I think, when you were describing the teachings of provisionism, not only the illuminating grace, the gospel message, that's how Leighton presents it, but also you mentioned, I think, the work of Christ on the cross.
Yeah, from Article 4 of the traditional statement, we affirm that grace is God's generous decision to provide salvation for any person by taking all of the initiative in providing atonement, right? So all of the work for salvation is accomplished by Christ, and as provisionists hold, we're simply accepting a gift. We don't do work.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to eliminate the semi-Pelagian
by the V. Although I'm not a provisionist,
slander
but I'm trying my best to understand the acrostic.
Guilt by so I mean, it just seems to eliminate that entirely.
It is an odd situation where both of us are not provisionists, as far as I know, because, as you said, it is potentially very broad. That said, the point of this question is, isn't this phrase so broad that it does include a situation where the grace that's provided is the grace of just allowing people to exist, this first grace of being created and continuing to exist, the gospel message, and the death of Christ on the cross, but not some additional. Go ahead.
If I think I'm understanding you, if I may, are you wondering if semi-Pelagians could fall within provisionism? If that's your question, I would say yes, that they could, because the term is so broad. But that doesn't mean that provisionism itself is identical with semi-Pelagianism, but it certainly allows for it.
Okay.
Is that fair? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Sure. Yeah. The idea that the two things are identical, obviously I haven't argued for that, and that wasn't the thesis of the debate that I proposed. So the O in provide, it says open door, and this says the divine provision is offered impartially to all, for anyone to enter through faith, for whosoever may come to his open arms. Doesn't this at least imply that what makes a difference in salvation is the human agent, not divine grace?
False dilemma. False dilemma.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally have issues with just the way that's worded. Impartially to all. The reality is not everyone's heard the gospel, and so that's why the open door is sort of tricky. I wouldn't use this language to describe my own positions. There's a general call, of course, for anyone to come. So maybe it's an open call, an open invitation.
So my question isn't whether it's affirming a general call as opposed to, you have to first figure out if you're elect and then come or something like that. I'm asking whether this statement, when it says impartially to all, that the implication behind that is the reason some people do come and others don't come does not lie in the grace that God has given. Instead, it lies in the human agent.
I see. I think the position allows for that, but it also allows for the necessity of grace, either externally or even internally, so that it's offered to all, for anyone through whom God has provided grace to enter through faith. So again, this is where we just have a description so vague, it allows for both positions.
So in this case, you might allow for a position like, let's say, Arminianism, which teaches prevenient grace, that enables people to come. Because especially if it's a universal prevenient grace, which is, I think, typically held. But it doesn't seem like it would accommodate an Augustinian view that some people are saved because God gives them an irresistible grace, and other people are not saved because they sin and God doesn't give them a grace to overcome that.
Right. So the Calvinist would disagree with the provision being offered to all. It's only offered to some.
Well, the impartiality, the implication behind that impartiality is that an implied accusation that the Calvinist system is partial because God's grace is doled out differently to different people. Is that, do you agree with that implication, or?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right. Turning to
again,
go ahead.
I was going to say, again, just to be clear to our audience, we're not necessarily here to debate whether it's a true or false proposition. That's a debate for another evening.
And presumably with someone who agrees with the position, that would be a good. So destroyed, the D says destroyed, and it says for unbelief and resisting the Holy Spirit's drawing to God's mercy will be the divine provision of justice. Doesn't this seem to imply that the basis for condemnation is not the sin of the people, except for the sin of unbelief or resisting the Holy Spirit's drawing, but all other sins, murder and so forth, are not the basis of destruction?
Yeah, I think that's a fair reading. It doesn't say that sin is the reason for eternal destruction. At least, a specific particular sin.
However, when it says
Paul said, "You perish because they refuse to love the truth so as to be saved."
This is
That's the Apostle Paul.
Both
Yep.
a purely, if that's such a thing, purely semi-Pelagian view, and also an Arminian view, or yeah.
Well, yeah. So to that, I don't know that semi-Pelagianism is so particularly and narrowly defined to address rejection of the gospel, but rather that man can take the initial step devoid of grace.
Okay. On the E for eternal security in the acronym, it says, is the divine provision that is everlasting for all true believers. Now, I can understand it. You started to talk about the 5th century folks, and I could see why this particular piece wouldn't seem to, the Cassianites, if you want to call them that, or they wouldn't necessarily buy into this particular point of provisionism. So if someone was going to say what the Cassianites believe, that's semi-Pelagian. Now, in terms of the definitions that you offered from the dictionary, those definitions wouldn't exclude this plank of eternal security. Is that accurate?
Sorry, say that again.
Your definitions from the dictionaries, they do not
Right.
exclude this eternal security, even though Cassian would probably think this is nonsense.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Again, the definition is so broad that it wouldn't get into perseverance or preservation.
All right. Well, I don't think I have enough time to ask another good question. So the 5 seconds left, I'll just turn back over.
All right. Thank you for that. All right, Kurt, you're up for your 20-minute cross-examination of Turretin.
Great. I'm having a fun time here, Frank. So thanks for indulging me with my answers. We haven't gotten much into the historical anachronism yet. And before we get to the 5th century, let's maybe start with the term and its origin. So because I've watched your prep episodes, I know that you have read what I think is an excellent work by Baucus and Grudrian. It's this semi-Pelagianism, the origins of the term, and its passage into the history of heresy. So since I need to ask a question, can you confirm that you've read this article?
Yes, and I found it a delight to read. It definitely is a step forward in the historical inquiry. A lot of previous works would just cite Nicholas Sanders or other Roman Catholics fighting Molina, and then still others noticed the Lutheran slightly before then in the Formula of Concord, but they took it to the next step. But they didn't go so far as, go ahead.
I was going to say, so for our audience, can you confirm that the term semi-Pelagian didn't appear until the writings of Theodore Beza? What year was it that it appeared?
So according to their article, 1556 is when that term appeared. So approximately 1,000 years after the Second Council of Orange in 529. So, and now it's persisted since then, but it apparently came to be for the first time then. A couple people say that the schoolmen used this term, but I couldn't find it in the schoolmen myself. So.
And who was the target? Who was the audience of Beza at that time?
So that's an interesting question. Go ahead.
I was going to say, was it the 5th century? Was it the 5th century monks?
No, it wasn't the 5th century monks. The primary people that he had in mind, well, one of them was actually a former member of the Reformed Church in Geneva. One particular guy, Turretin, Francis Turretin, for whose name I adopt for these online discussions, his Institutes of Elenctic Theology identify that same guy as the leader of modern semi-Pelagianism. So that's the target that Beza had originally, and that the early scholastic reformers used as their kind of target.
And was this term embraced by the opponents of Beza?
Meaning like this, I think his name was Castillo or something like that. As far as I know,
Yeah.
no one has ever wanted to be have that name applied to them. The closest I found were two people. One of them was Finney, but Finney said, basically, let's get past this label and just talk about whether or not it's right, which I think is probably in many ways a more important debate, of course. And Arminius, who apparently at one point suggested maybe semi-Pelagianism is just the truth. And he suggested maybe halfway between two different errors, between the error of Pelagius and some other error, that would be a semi-Pelagianism, and that would be okay. But then afterwards, I think he kind of, he took some heat for that comment, and afterwards said, the point is, let's just get to the truth and not worry about the labels.
So as far as you've seen pertaining to the work of Bacchus and Guderian, the semi-Pelagian label, would you agree that it was used back in the 16th century in a pejorative manner in most, if not all, cases?
But yes, a pejorative manner, yes, because it's a critical label, definitely. It's a negative label because it's saying that someone's making an error in the direction of Pelagianism, which is a very serious error. And even the people who are kind of reluctantly using the term will sometimes say, well, this isn't heresy, this is like on its way to heresy, something like that.
And in the 16th century, perhaps a little early 17th century, is there unanimous agreement about what the term means?
Well, I mean, in terms of even almost any word in the English language, that's true, that there's not universal agreement on the meaning. So, of course not, no.
And can we find meaningful disagreement on the term, or is it broader in nature with regard to seeing how the authors describe the use of the label?
I think we could probably see some good, not just I think, we can see some good general, a center of the cloud and fuzzy edges to it in terms of the usage of the term. Like a lot of words that have a kind of vague boundaries to the exact, is this semi-Pelagianism? Is this full Pelagianism? That kind of thing. Sometimes those words get used interchangeably. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that could help transition to your definition here as you've defined it on one of your slides. 1, 2, 3, 4 definition, semi-Pelagian. If you could tell me, are these 3 sentences a description? Are they a definition? A and B seem to be connected through the conjunctive or. So, you say a system that includes errors that are in the direction of Pelagianism. Is that, what do you mean in the direction of Pelagianism?
So the example I gave was one of the classic examples of semi-Pelagianism, which is the nature of man is harmed by the fall, but not rendered incapable of doing what God commands, which is, I think, the right interpretation of the provide acronym, and it's also halfway between the Augustinian position that it's dead and the Pelagian position that it's just fine.
So could someone be 1% Pelagian? Suppose you're fully Augustinian and you drink a little bit of the Kool-Aid and you are now 1% Pelagian, 99% Augustinian. Does that make someone a semi-Pelagian?
I think it might be better in some cases to focus on whether specific doctrines are Pelagian or semi-Pelagian, as opposed to trying to make that the entire person, unless, I suppose there's maybe some reasons to do that. But there's a difference between saying that Leighton Flowers holds to some semi-Pelagian doctrines and saying that he is a semi-Pelagian. It's maybe a very small difference, but there is a difference.
Why can't we just say Leighton holds to Pelagian errors? Why does it have to be semi-Pelagian errors?
Well, that's where one of my other definition comes into place, which is if he holds to a few Pelagian errors, but not the whole kit and caboodle, then maybe semi-Pelagian is a good way of describing that system. So a system that incorporates, let's say, 2 or 3 of the main.
Well, as Dr. Bonner noted, Pelagius himself affirmed 1/2 of 1 of the 14
And
There were 14 points of Pelagianism as levied by Augustine, and Pelagius affirmed 1/2 of 1 point. So Pelagius was 1/28 Pelagian, but they don't call him semi-Pelagian; they call him Pelagian.
So that's falling
It
short of the
just
full
doesn't seem to
Pelagian
be
error on that
consistent
point.
at
So he's
all.
not fully Pelagian on every plank, but some of his teachings might indeed, like I said, his teachings violate the Council of Ephesus, or not Ephesus, Carthage. I think it was adopted by Ephesus perhaps, but the Council of Carthage, one of those canons, he seems to pretty clearly violate. And that's a Pelagian error. I mean, by most definitions of what's a Pelagian error. So,
but
on that
some
point,
of his views are Augustinian. So could we also say that Leighton is semi-Augustinian?
I think he would take offense to that description because how much he dislikes Augustine. But even if it wasn't for just a matter of
but you don't take any
his
offense
feelings
at
to use that
semi-Pelagian,
term, which
do
I
you?
think he doesn't like the term semi-Pelagian either.
Yeah, if they're going to stop
don't have
calling
a
me
problem
something because I
with
take offense to it, then we wouldn't be having this debate, would we?
Charitably, sparing someone's feelings, if that's the issue. In other words, my point is not so much whether or not this label should be revised in a kinder way, as it is to suggest that the underlying, what this term generally means in systematic theology, that's met by Provisionism as it's taught by Leighton Flowers.
So, I'm concerned that the definition of semi-Pelagian that you've provided is too broad, that it's, as you said, it's a cloud, there's fuzzy, there's a core, but it's fuzzy on the outside. And I don't even know if we can see in the inside of the cloud, because there aren't specifics per se, whereas with a systematic definition, there is that specific of, man taking the initial steps toward salvation. So I'm wondering if I could read for you some quotes from church fathers, and if you could tell me if they are semi-Pelagian. So that's, trying to gauge here. So here's the first one. And again, if you could tell me if it's semi-Pelagian. But suppose that ignorance and difficulty are the natural state of the soul, that it begins there and advances toward knowledge, and rest as the happy life is brought to perfection within it. Even so, the soul is not denied the power to make this progress by piety and diligent study of the highest things. Does that sound semi-Pelagian? The soul is not denied the power to make this progress? I take it you're looking up the quote.
Of course, I think almost as with anything, I think that it's very important to find out what's the context to the statement,
Yep.
and, to try and interpret it in context. As I don't have a context in which to place it, it becomes a little bit hard. We could try to break it down. If I had the actual quotation, I tried to type out some of it. The first part was, suppose that ignorance and difficulty are the natural
state. Yeah.
And that,
and in spite of the ignorance and difficulty, the soul is not denied the power to make this progress by piety and diligent study of the highest things.
To my mind, that sounds a little bit like something that I had seen in Cassian's writings. But with Cassian, he kind of gives and he takes away. So in some cases, it sounds like he's saying that. Well, I think it's in maybe one or two places at least, he actually comes right out and says that he seems to say that people could do this without grace. And in other cases, it seems like he's talking about cases where people do get grace. So, what exactly to do with Cassian on those points? Is do we explain one by the other by the, do we go to the later Cassian to explain the earlier Cassian and so forth? I don't know if this is Cassian. I don't have that kind of memory. And yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Does it sound semi-Pelagian, right? Sort of the freedom of the will pertains post-fall, and there's not a super added grace. There's a grace from creation, but there's not a super added grace that has to kind of correct the will. This author says there's ignorance and difficulty, but the soul is not denied the power to make this progress. That sounds semi-Pelagian, doesn't it?
I mean, to be blunt, it sort of sounds like it could be referring to somebody like Plato. It's not even a Christian theologian. That's such a general statement. It's hard to judge based on just a snippet like that. But I will say that the theme that's there that the soul can make, if the implication that the author has is that the soul is doing this of its own accord, just based on its own intrinsic nature, then that sounds like it could be Pelagian or it could be semi-Pelagian, but it doesn't, which of those it is going to depend on additional information you have. And again, a lot of this could be unwound if you say that, in the context there's some other information. So,
all right,
sorry, I hope that's helpful. I don't know. Yeah.
Let's take another one here. Only something that is seen can incite the will to act. We control whether we accept or reject whether we see, but we do not control what we see. So we control whether we accept or reject whether we see. So there's power of the will there. We control those two outcomes.
We control what we see?
Yeah, whether we see, not what we see.
They control.
Does that sound semi-Pelagian?
I don't know. It's tough. As I said, with snippets, it's hard to, it doesn't, I don't have, it's not like I claim to have some sixth sense where I get a rusty taste in my mouth when I hear a semi-Pelagian quote.
Let me give you a last one, and I'll read a little broader. Hopefully this will give you greater context. For all these things, the Creator deserves praise for instilling in us the power to set out from such a beginning and reach the highest good, for helping us along the way, for fulfilling and completing those who make progress, and for ordaining a most just condemnation for those who sin, that is, for those who refuse to move beyond their starting point or who fall back after they make some progress. Does that sound semi-Pelagian?
That could almost be some early Augustinian writing. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So all three of these quotations come from On Free Choice of the Will. And do you know why I think this is relevant to our debate? Since I have to ask a question.
With my mind reading powers, my thought is that you'd like to make it, Augustine versus Augustine, or Augustine versus Augustine, or old Augustine versus young Augustine, this kind of thing. So
there you go.
And Augustine recognized his own shift, and he mentioned it, and he explained it, and he tried to justify his change in views.
Yeah, and are you aware that the Gallic monks used Augustine's writings against Prosper of Aquitaine?
I don't remember that specific event, but that doesn't at all surprise me. They had fierce back and forth, Prosper of Aquitaine and the others in Gaul. So it wasn't really Gaul at that time anymore, but anyway, it's just that area.
So if the early Augustine were semi-Pelagian, would that open your mind to the possibility that the term itself, semi-Pelagian, is just so vague and too broad, too big of a cloud, to use your analogy, that it really doesn't help us narrow down the theological distinctives?
I think that no. I mean, the short answer is no. I think that it's fine if the term is so broad that it encompasses people before Cassian, like Origen. Aspects of Origen, I think, fall well within the scope of what I've described, and I think as well probably within. I'm not 100% sure that they fall within the scope of those two dictionary definitions you provided, but they very well might. And Evagrius, who seems to be Cassian's source for a lot of his views. I think again the Origen, Evagrius, Cassian trail may indeed meet a broad definition of semi-Pelagian without meeting a more narrow definition. And also, I appreciate that there's value to broad terms and there's value to very narrow and very specific terms. I think the Cassianite label would be much less useful today, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so looking back on the systematic definitions, which I know you've also done, if it's shown that there are no semi-Pelagians in 5th century Roman Gaul, the early Augustine himself holding to that view of the Gallic monks, and the wide array of Christians today who allegedly hold this view, but in reality don't, what value is there in the term other than that it's a pejorative word for people that disagree with one's self?
Well, if it were just a term for non-Calvinists or non-Augustinians, even then, I suppose it would just be that there's a simpler term to say non-Augustinians. But of course, the non-Augustinian realm includes Pelagians, and Pelagianism is a very serious heresy. So it's nice to have a term that says you're not an Augustinian and that distinguishes you from being a Pelagian. In that way, it's actually a helpful term. Yeah.
Can you be non-Augustinian and non-Pelagian?
Well, you could be a non-Christian altogether, right? Like you could.
Within Christendom, yeah.
I mean, at least we're whittling down, narrowing the field a bit. So you could be non-Augustinian and you could be non-Pelagian, and that is zone, on these key issues, not on every single issue that Augustine ever had, but on these key issues, that's where we find semi-Pelagianism.
Right. So Augustine separates nature and grace. He says, I myself was also convinced when I was in similar error, thinking that faith whereby we believe on God is not God's gift, but that is in us from ourselves. Elsewhere, he says in a letter to Simplician, in the solution of this question, I labored indeed on behalf of the free choice of the human will, but God's grace overcame. So here he separates nature and grace. This plausibly is also the error of Pelagius. What of Christians who believe that a doctrine of concurrence, that it's both the grace of God and free will of man? That would be a non-Augustinian position and a non-Pelagian position, would it not?
Well, there are non-Augustinian and non-Pelagian positions. That's kind of the central thesis of my argument. Yes. Now, whether
could Provisionists be non-Augustinian and non-Pelagian?
Yeah, of course. That's exactly.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for that wonderful cross-sex, and you made my job easy. I appreciate that. Didn't have to jump in at all. Appreciate that very much. All right, so we are going to transition to our closing remarks. Both of these are 5-minute closings. Audience, make sure you get your questions in so we can have a very involved Q&A. So with that said, Fan, you're up first for your 5-minute closing, and I will start your time as soon as you begin to speak.
Thanks very much. Going through the counterpoints to the arguments I've made, first of all, one of them was that this is just a useless term. Of course, the usage for the last 5 centuries or so in Reformed theological systematics, as well as in Lutheran and Roman Catholic usage as well, belies that the idea that it's just a useless term. It may not be a particularly well-loved term by people to whom it's applied, and that might be an argument for us to eventually phase it out in favor of better terms. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a meaning, and it doesn't mean that meaning isn't fairly clear. I agree that terms sometimes have fuzzy edges. This is one of those terms that has fuzzy edges, but having fuzzy edges doesn't mean it doesn't have a meaning. And the views of Leighton Flowers fall squarely within that boundary. Now, I appreciate the idea that maybe we can't evaluate provisionism based on Leighton Flowers, but from my standpoint, if Leighton Flowers isn't a provisionist, then I don't know what a provisionist is. And if he doesn't represent provisionism, again, I don't know who does. And I do agree that this provisionism graphic by itself is woefully inadequate to the task of defining it. So I think it's a reasonable thing to interpret the acronym the way that its number one promoter, Leighton Flowers, interprets it and defines it and explains it. But, obviously people may disagree about that point. As to the question of whether or not there were semi-Pelagians in 5th century Roman Gaul, the question depends on a definition of what that term means. The term wasn't around then. Beliefs like Leighton's, but perhaps not as close to Pelagianism as Leighton's are, were around. Were they exactly the same? Probably not. We're not claiming that there was provisionism in that time period, but in any event, whether or not the semi-Pelagian, so-called semi-Pelagian controversy actually involves semi-Pelagians is an interesting debate, and it depends greatly on how you define semi-Pelagianism. And I'm not sure we made enough progress to answer that question, but whether or not Cassian meets the definition I provided, or whether it meets the definition that was provided by Dr. Jarvis, we can kind of leave that to the side. Instead, we can focus more on this question of what does illuminating grace mean. My suggestion is that we go with how that's been explained by Leighton Flowers, which is that it's the gospel, not irresistible grace as in Calvinism, and not prevenient grace as in Arminianism. The idea that it could be some kind of concurrent grace, again, that's not an explanation that's been offered by Leighton Flowers to my knowledge. I suppose if it were, it would depend what that means. And it would be hard to understand how it could align with the other teachings of Flowers on this subject. The issue of election, again, the election isn't exactly mentioned in the Provisionism graphic. I'll kind of leave that a little bit to the side. The issue of justification doesn't appear to be directly related to the question of the Augustinian Pelagian spectrum. Instead, it seems to be related to the question of sola fide, which wasn't, there aren't any of neither the definition that Dr. Jarvis provided nor my definition addresses that issue directly. So we can, again, set that issue to the side. The question of whether or not Christ's death on the cross is gracious, we acknowledge it is, but it's not the kind of grace that the dictionary definitions that Dr. Jarvis provided are talking about. The same thing, the gospel message is gracious, but it's not the kind of grace that's referred to in these dictionary definitions. The Holy Spirit's drawing, again, that's, according to Flowers, that's met by the gospel message itself, which, again, falls short. Now, to the narrow point of whether or not semi-Pelagianism is exactly identical to Provisionism, of course, the answer is no. It would be handy if it was that neat, but it isn't. What I'm suggesting is that Provisionism, as it's explained by Leighton Flowers, as it's promulgated by Soteriology 101, is semi-Pelagian, and it teaches many semi-Pelagian and sometimes even Pelagian errors. And I've demonstrated that from the canons of councils on semi-Pelagianism and Pelagianism, to the extent that those canons are taken as a definition of those terms. Thanks.
All right, thank you. All right, Dr. Kurt, you're up for your 5-minute closing, and I'll start your time as soon as you begin to speak.
As you'll recall in my opening remarks, I provided 3 main arguments for thinking that Provisionism is not semi-Pelagianism. First, I considered doctrinal differences. We looked at the concept of nature and grace, we looked at election, and we looked at justification. So I'll briefly remark on those subpoints. First, the issue of nature and grace. The provisionist acrostic provide is so broad that it could allow for a range of theological models within the camp of provisionism. And so Frank has said that for justification, he didn't see how it was relevant. I'm not sure he quite used that term, but he didn't see how even the definition I provided from the systematic theological dictionaries, how it would be relevant to the subject matter. Well, I'm happy to explain how it is relevant, because the definition of semi-Pelagianism does allow for a faith plus works model. The individual takes the initial steps of salvation, and then grace comes later. Just to paraphrase a number of definitions for semi-Pelagianism. This allows for a view of a Roman Catholic view of justification, but the provisionist, as a Protestant, however, would reject those models of justification. So let's suppose that you thought that there were semi-Pelagians in the 5th century. These Gallic monks were semi-Pelagians. You would read their writings and come away thinking, oh gosh, they hold to works righteousness. Well, the provisionist, on the other hand, does not. the provisionist holds to sola fide, thereby demonstrating that it is relevant as a point for showing how provisionism is not semi-Pelagianism. So I think it is relevant. When we look at concurrence and grace, Frank said he's not sure how Leighton Flowers would respond. Well, again, here I think there's a mistake in thinking that anything Leighton Flowers says represents provisionism. I don't think it does. Provisionism is broader, as it's described in the acrostic. It's broader than the views of Leighton Flowers. And so one could logically hold to a concurrent view of grace, and might even think that the eye of illuminating grace allows for internal grace to operate. It could be concurrent grace. I also talked about formal causality as God's grace. And so I don't think that Frank satisfactorily responded to those. Rather, he used Leighton as the exemplar of provisionism, when I'm not convinced that we ought to do that. Secondly, I looked at historical anachronisms, and you heard Frank himself grant the pejorative manner of the term as it originated, and that there's no one who really identifies, no one in the 16th century who identified as a semi-Pelagian. Perhaps there are two exceptions he brought up, but really that the term, no one, generally speaking, identifies as a semi-Pelagian. There are other ways to identify one's view of nature and grace. Frank himself, towards the end of our cross-examination, said that a provisionist could be a non-Augustinian and a non-Pelagian. There are other ways that are not semi-Pelagian or semi-Augustinian. There are Eastern Greek notions, for example, that look at the concurrence of nature and grace. So that's available to the provisionist and to provisionism. Finally, I want to really hit home here on a point granted in the closing statement by Frank, that he has admitted that provisionism is not identical to semi-Pelagianism, and rather that the question he was seeking to answer was, is provisionism semi-Pelagian in the adjectival use? That wasn't the agreed upon question of our discussion, and so I think that's a different issue, obviously related, but a different issue. Rather, this was a question of identity. Does provisionism qualify as semi-Pelagianism? And it appears far from it. It does not. Perhaps there are semi-Pelagians within provisionism, but that's not the same thing as saying that provisionism is semi-Pelagianism. So that's a critical point. We didn't get to talk much about the Second Council of Orange, and hopefully I'll get a chance to hop on Frank's program, Conversations in Calvinism. But there's really a whole world to be discovered when one reads the primary sources of the Gallic monks, because the Second Council of Orange itself is questionable as to whether it rejected semi-Pelagianism. And Frank has even admitted as much in one of his prepisodes. And so I'd be delighted to go on his program and talk more about that, but I encourage others to read the Gallic monks and to consider that the systematic theologies they've learned from are mistaken on a historical basis.
All right, guys. Fantastic job, guys. Fantastic job. Appreciate you guys again for a fabulous debate. And the audience did enjoy it, as I did as well, and learned a whole bunch. And that is the goal, for the most part, of hearing these debates, man. Continue to grow in knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so we are going to transition to the Q&A. And we have a whole bunch of questions here for you guys. So we will go here with a super chat. Here, this is coming from Manny Jones. Thank you, Manny, for the question. It may be a little pixelated on your side, guys. So if you need me to, I will repeat the question as many times as you need me to. All right, question from Manny Jones. It doesn't really say who it's to, but let's see. Did anyone other than Noah find grace, or were they not part of the all, quote unquote, the all provisionists say? Dr. Kurt, what do you think?
I'm having a little difficulty gauging Manny's intention here. Did anyone other than Noah find grace? I'm not sure what he means, even by find grace. So yeah, just to be straight up with Manny,
not a very good question,
about
Manny.
what he means.
All right, True with the fan. Any thoughts?
I think the expression is taken from Genesis 6:8, which says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord," and I think that's where it comes from. That's right after Genesis 6:7, and the Lord said, "I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repents me that I have made them." And then it says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord."
Yeah. So,
I don't. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, in context there, yeah, it's more of a God giving grace to Noah rather than Noah seeking and pulling himself up by his own bootstraps to find grace.
All right, I forgot to give you guys the rules of the Q&A too. My bad. Both of you guys get 1 minute, and there's no interrupting.
Apologies.
No, you good. I didn't give you the rules, so that's my fault. All right, so here's the next question here. This is for you, tourism fan.
I'll stay here until he's done.
Has Frank read The Myth of Semi-Pelagianism by Dr. Ali Bonner? Second question, if Provisionist is semi-Pelagian, can Calvinism be called semi-Gnosticism given Augustinian's history?
I've read portions of Ali Bonner's book. There's a number of shortcomings that I didn't care for that I quickly discovered, which included that she doesn't include Pelagius's commentary on Romans among Pelagius' work in terms of evaluating what Pelagius believed. There are reasons why she might not, because of the editing that's occurred over the years, but it takes, unfortunately, it drastically shrinks the body of Pelagius' works. And then when she evaluates what Pelagius did or didn't believe.
But you have to shrink it because that work has now been corrupted. That's why she did that.
I don't think it's the only exclusion either that's significant, but that one was already quite significant from my standpoint. As to the second part of the question, if Provisionism is semi-Pelagian, can Calvinism be called semi-Gnosticism given Augustine's history? So no, it's not a historical question of whether or not something is semi-Pelagian is not because somebody has a history of previously having been Pelagian. Now they're not anymore, so that makes them semi-Pelagian. Augustine refuted Manichaeism, and he was no longer Manichaean. He continued to fight and push back on people who suggested otherwise. Even, I think, some of the Gallic monks had kind of suggested that he might be influenced that way. And he responded, and first, I think, Prosper of Aquitaine responded, and then Augustine later responded in a slightly different way. In terms of whether or not it can be called that, I think if you're going to use the same kind of rationale I used, you'd need to have some concepts where there's a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum is Gnosticism, and the other end
the work that Pelagius that we have from Pelagius that Dr. Bonner identified as reliable was preserved because it was conflated and confused by people. They thought it was the writings of Jerome and even the output of the Council of Nicaea. So the writings of Pelagius that we have is extremely orthodox in its content. And even a few months ago, Anthony Rogers accidentally quoted Pelagius, thinking it was the work of Jerome, and appealed to it as sound. So, pointing to Pelagius as some sort of problem is a problem in and of itself.
The book. My doctoral research looked at the 5th century Gallic monks, commonly, frequently referred to as the semi-Pelagians. I like what Frank said, Cassian and company, Vincent of Lorenz and Faustus of Ries, the two other of the three main ones. John Cassian be the best, most common representative. And Faustus's works are not translated into English, except for 2 letters. So that's, one of the problems with reading Faustus is only people who read Latin can understand him. So I haven't read the book to the sect by Bonner, but also let me say I don't have much disagreement with the way Frank described the Pelagian controversy. I didn't have much to quibble over that. My main research area is on the alleged semi-Pelagian controversy. That's really what's of interest to me. The second question, I want to say a couple things here. Just to be highly technical and pedantic, someone can call Calvinism whatever they want. It doesn't mean it's accurate. But 2, we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing. This is part of my beef with semi-Pelagianism, calling something semi-Gnosticism. I think that's frankly, I think, oh, pun intended. Frankly, I think that's ridiculous. Just stick to the doctrinal subjects that are in question and decide whether you think those are true or false. And we should use labels as best we can. You know, Calvinism, Arminianism, those are reasonable labels. But trying to pigeonhole people, to shoehorn them into labels they wouldn't agree with, and really is just too broad, I don't think is fair at all. So that'd be how I would answer the second question.
All right. Thank you guys very much. And here is a question coming from Mr. Warren McGrew. This is for you, Turitan, as obviously it is. How many of the 14 points of Pelagianism must one affirm to be a semi-Pelagian? Pelagius affirmed 1 out of the 28.
1 out of 28 out of 14. That's really something. But no, I think he's referring to what, again, to Dr. Bonner's, I suppose I should say, there's another Gerald Bonner who's also a scholar in the field. So Dr. Ali Bonner's claim that of the 14 points of Pelagianism identified by Augustine at one point, that Pelagius only held half of one, or something to that effect. I find a better way of, or a more unambiguous way of defining Pelagianism is probably going to the Council of Carthage of 418, looking at those canons that condemn Pelagianism there. I know that Dr. Jaras has suggested that the Second Council of Orange are also condemning Pelagian errors rather than semi-Pelagian errors. And if so, that would just expand it. And, you know, it's not purely a question of a math, like 3 points is, you know, you're good, but at 4 points, you become magically a semi-Pelagian or something like that. I think, you know, in practice, the issue would be something like, if you hold to substantially all of the views, and maybe there's 1 or 2 you don't, they're going to sound like it fits better in the Pelagian category. And if you hold to, you know, somewhere in the middle, that's going to look more like a semi-Pelagian category. And if you questionably hold to 1/2 of 1 point, that doesn't sound very Pelagian at all. I don't think that's certainly not the way that the term gets used usually, although one Reformed author described one of the leading Reformed authors as having a semi-Pelagian anthropology because of something he said about the Mary, you know, that only her body was purified for some reason. So someone said that issue on that point, he's taking a semi-Pelagian anthropology. So, you know, that I think that's a useful description of, you know, when you define it narrowly on a doctrinal point and not say, of course, Van Maastricht isn't generally a semi-Pelagian, he's generally quite high Calvinist. But, you know, in any event, back over to you.
All right, Doctor.
Oh, I get to answer questions not directed to me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was a point of contention regarding the term semi-Pelagian, as some of you may remember. You know, how much of Pelagian positions have to be embraced to be semi-Pelagian? And I even said, I believe it was in my opener, it may have been my rebuttal, you know, if we're looking at a rejection of paedobaptism, which was Pelagius's position, and which is part of the discussions in the canons, then James White is semi-Pelagian. But that would be insane, right? No one's going to say that. So the concern is, you know, how much of one thing does one have to hold? And I think, you know, I still sort of would push back on Frank's position here. That it, you know, it might not be 1.5, but it might be 2, maybe 3 of 10. You know, I just think there are questions here about the broadness of the label. So in a sense, I share Idol Killer's concern about the use of labels here. How many of the 14 points must one affirm to be semi-Pelagian? So yeah, that does touch on one of the concerns I had in the debate.
All right. And here is a question. GMW, thank you for the question. Is this a difficult debate because of the real reason the term semi-Pelagianism was created and how it is used by people? What do you think, Kurt?
Yeah. Yes, affirmative. And even in Frank's example about a Reformed author calling another Reformed author semi-Pelagian due to the views of Mary, that's a perfect example of the pejorative use of this term. The history, the origin, and contemporary usage is that it, for many people, is just an insult. And in most, if not all these cases, there's no grounding, there's no basis for it. I'm still waiting for these semi-Pelagians to come out of the woodwork to say that we don't need grace at all. Now, maybe there's a disagreement on the type of grace that exists or is needed. But that just means that the definition is sloppy and needs refining, which again was an issue Frank brought up with about the dictionary definitions. And I'm happy to agree with that. If we want to define semi-Pelagianism more narrowly to say that it's like the rejection of regenerative grace, then yeah, okay, but then Arminians are semi-Pelagian. So I just think it needs work, and it does make, getting back to the question, it does make these debates
and R.C.
difficult.
Sproul and other
debating
leading
terminology.
Calvinists they have all called Arminians semi-Pelagians over the years. That's nothing new.
It's not just an insult.
Anything other than Augustinian, they're wanting to pigeonhole into that group.
There's a difference between a criticism and an insult. And the fact that it's a negative label doesn't mean that it has no content value. And it's not, depending on the actual definition that you develop, it's not that hard to find people who are semi-Pelagian. If you use the Nicholas Sanders definition, for example, you'll find that there were his contemporaries among Roman Catholics who are semi-Pelagians. If you look at the Lutheran definition, you'll see the people that Lutherans were targeting, which were other Lutherans, those are the semi-Pelagians. If you look at Beza's use, you can see him naming names of who are these semi-Pelagians. Same thing with other authors of systematic theologies. And even if you turn to Cassian and you go to his Conference 13, Section 11, you'll find material there. The editor's title is "Whether the Grace of God Precedes or Follows Our Good Will." That's not Cassian's label as far as I know, but it's the editor's label. But that's the reason why people like Rebecca Hardin-Weaver, who I think Dr. Jarris cited in his dissertation on this topic, she concludes that he does think that man can take the initiative and grace can follow in some cases, not necessarily in all cases. So that would be within that definition, the dictionary definition of semi-Pelagian that was offered during the debate.
All right. And here's a question for you, Turretin.
Someone asked me a question on Cassian, please.
I don't know if anybody's going to ask it, man. A lot of these questions for Turretin. I told you, Turretin, that these guys will come at you, man. I told you, man, they'll come at you hard, man. But yeah, anyway, here's a question from Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for the question. Do you have a problem with Lutherans saying the word and sacraments are the primary means of grace, or is that different than provisionism?
So that is a terminology that they use. I don't claim to be an expert on Lutheranism. I did listen to some of Dr. Jordan Cooper's discussion of why he believes that Soteriology 101's teaching, which I've identified as provisionism, is semi-Pelagian. I thought that his arguments were compelling, but I don't know the exact reasons why he doesn't believe Lutheranism is semi-Pelagian. I think that the reason would be in that confessional Lutheranism does have a very prominent role for grace. So depending on the definition of semi-Pelagianism that you end up with, if it's so broad as to include Arminians, then I'm not sure how you're going to exclude many Lutherans, if not also the confessional Lutherans. But if you include the narrower one that was mentioned by Dr. Jarris, the one that says that man takes the initiative without grace, that narrower one, I think that confessional Lutherans will deny that there's an absence of prevening grace. So they'll just take a position that the grace precedes all of our works because man's dead in sin, and that's the kind of Luther's bondage of the will adopted in some form or other by by those confessional Lutherans. I hope that's an adequate answer. I'm not an expert on the subject. So.
All right. Kurt?
I'm also far from an expert on it. I might say that they are semi-sacerdotalists for that position. And how is it different than provisionism? Provisionism, as I've been saying, is so broad. You know, I'm not sure precisely what provisionists might say about the word and sacrament being the primary means of grace. So, yeah, I'll essentially pass on that question.
All right. And let me see if I can see anything for Kurt. I don't see anything for you, Kurt, man.
Can I just have 1 minute to talk about Cassian and divine grace?
I don't know, man. Hold on.
Frank, you'll have to bring me on for a conversation in Calvinism, and we'll talk about Cassian's views.
Yeah, I think
it might be nice.
Be good. I would love to hear you guys talk about that. I think that'd be a fun conversation for you guys. Sorry, here's another question for you, Turretin. They're coming at you hard, man. How do you interpret Paul's being alive prior to personal sin in Romans chapter 7, verse 9?
Romans 7:9.
Just say he's personifying Adam and move on. Oh.
So the text is obviously part of a longer passage. I'll go back a couple of verses to give a little bit of context. 7:7 says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead, for I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me." So yeah, I don't take that Paul is speaking in the person of Adam here, but I do take it as Paul is not he's experiencing the condemnation of the law, and that's what he means. When he was unaware of the law, he was unaware of his condemnation, and that's how I take this, as his recognition of his death, not as the law, making him from a situation of being spiritually alive to changing him into a situation of spiritually dead.
All right. Kurt?
Yeah, I mean, this question, like some others, aren't relevant to our debate. And formally speaking, I'm not a New Testament scholar. I know that some of the positions on Romans 7 are that Paul is personifying Adam. He's doing something tricky there. So that's, I don't have a hard position on the issue, and so I can't really address it.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left in Q&A here. So here's a question for both of you guys. Since provisionism is so broad in its doctrinal statement, and so many provisions believe differently on certain things, I'm confused about what he's trying to say there. Believe differently on so many things, certain things. I'm confused at what he meant at the end. I don't know if you guys take a crack at it, if you guys want to mess with it, but it's a bit difficult to see what he's getting at the end of that question or statement.
Well, if I could take it first, I'll say,
yeah.
Nick, I agree with you. Provisionism is so broad and such that it's not identical to semi-Pelagianism, but might have semi-Pelagians in their midst, might have full Pelagians, perhaps, and probably not. I have to go back and check. But yeah, so I think it is broad. I don't know if it's intentionally broad. And if I had to offer any advice to Leighton and other people within the provisionist movement, I would say go back to the drawing board and edit some of these statements, because Calvinists, on some of them, Calvinists and Arminians can affirm them. So try to define the terms in such a way
come on.
that distinguishes the provisionist movement from those two other camps. And I think you'll have
as if the tulip acrostic is all that well defined. Come on. I mean, provide is as well, if not better defined than tulip has been. It's been debated and argued among Calvinists for years as being too broad and critiquing it. And what about this? What about that? That's just a part of it.
It is. You're right. And that's why you get into sub views within Calvinism of like an infralapsarian, a supralapsarian, you know, the different ways that they understand the application of the atonement. There's all sorts of sub views.
It's the armchair quarterback. If I don't want to, you know, if I just want to sit back and critique everybody else who gets out there and does something, I can sit back and watch how you play the game, and then I can just critique it. And I love Kurt, but at the same time, come up with your own that perfectly defines and watch. Sit back and watch all the other armchair quarterbacks go, oh, this is so vague, and I don't know about this, and nitpick it, because that's exactly what every theologian is going to do. Is sit around and nitpick every little thing you say about whatever acrostic you want to come up with, you know, or just don't, you know, or just do like Kevin over at Fundamentals and just say, you know, drop all the labels and pretend like they don't exist. You know, a lot of different ways to take it.
Federal headship, this question didn't particularly say to anybody, but if federal headship is false and everyone is responsible for their sin, doesn't that mean people have the ability to respond to the gospel as well? Is the problem how one defines original sin? What do you think, Turitan?
So, of course, I think federal headship is true. I suppose that a fully explained position on federal headship only really comes around, I would say, with Francis Turton, the historical Francis Turton, not even maybe in its fullest extent with Calvin, much less with Augustine. And yet Augustine also taught original sin. And I'm not sure, you know, there are other different ways of getting to everyone inherits original sin aside from federal headship. I think federal headship's the best explanation, but there are traducianist explanations and there are other kinds of explanations for the universality of original sin that don't rely on it. So, as an example from Scripture, that's whether or not you think the right explanation is federal headship, you may remember that Levi paid tithes in the loins of Abraham, according to Scripture, when Abraham paid those to Melchizedek. So, although Abraham is the one who actually did it, Levi is attributed with this action because he's in Abraham's loins at the time. Now, I think federal headship's the best explanation of that, but if you take a traducianist explanation or some other explanation, in any event, that the idea that Levi has to do something to endorse Abraham's previous action is missing from the logic of Scripture there. So I think it doesn't follow. And now, of course, to ask to the second part, of course, how one defines original sin is very important. And to me, that's one of those main dimensions.
I think I was just muted. Yeah, I was muted. No, I said the whole issue of paying tithes. That's about future generations being blessed by people that did great things before you. And it's not a very clear, it's not talking about traducianism or sin being in the testicles, you know, that Augustine would run to. It's a very unclear passage, but often the Augustinian will hang their hat there, trying to defend their anthropology because the other proof texts are undone in context.
Frank answered this very well. The answer is no. It doesn't logically follow. You might hold to a Traducian view wherein inability is passed on through the seed of Adam. So the technical logical answer is no, it doesn't follow. It all does come down to original sin and contingently what you think has or has not been passed on from the fall. So the ability to respond hinges on one's view of original sin.
All right, and Kurt, we have a question from Warren here.
Cassian?
And he's going to answer the question. Who is this Cassian you speak of, and why is he important to this discussion?
All right. Well, I talked a little bit about John Cassian, why he's important, 5th century monk. But Why is he important to discussion? Multiple reasons. Because the way we interpret Cassian is going to affect how we interpret the Second Council of Orange. And how we interpret the Second Council of Orange is going to affect how we view contemporary discussions on the so-called semi-Pelagians and semi-Pelagianism. But to the issue of grace that Frank had brought up, so I thank you, Warren, for the question. There are some sections in Conference 13 which are questionable and suspect, but you have to read the whole thing. And so I just want to read one, possibly two passages here. So if there's a passage about man having free will or even taking the first steps, which, that's questionable, Cassian is clear. And so the grace of God always cooperates with our will for its advantage, and in all things assists, protects, and defends it in such a way as sometimes even to require and look for some effort of good will from it, that it may not appear to confer its gifts on one who is asleep or relaxed in a sluggish ease. He continues on. But there are ample passages about Cassian regarding the necessity of divine grace for anything. I shared a passage earlier about good thoughts coming from God. God incites the will. He drags people. Why does Cassian write this way? Here's the answer. He says, for the God of all must be held to work in all, so as to incite, protect, and strengthen, but not to take away the freedom of the will, which he himself has once given. He concludes Conference 13, the famous or infamous one, by saying essentially that we should avoid trying to delineate what exactly is divine grace and human freedom, because God works all things in us, and yet everything can be ascribed to free will cannot be fully grasped by the mind and reason of man. He's essentially, in a sense, agnostic about how it all actually plays out. That's his conclusion in Conference 13. So that's why it's really important to read the whole thing, not to take his passages out of context, which is what Prosper does when Prosper communicates to Augustine the views of Cassian. And the view of Prosper's interpretation of Cassian is what the systematic theologies today are based upon. And that's why it's important to do historical theology, because it affects the way we do systematic theology. We have to learn from the Christian tradition. So thank you, Warren, for your question.
All right, Churiton.
So I certainly agree that there's a lot of value in studying patristic literature, patristic era literature, whether or not they're church fathers. And I do have handy here, I don't know if it comes onto the camera view or not, the works of Cassian. There's a little picture of it. So, and I've taken the trouble to go through and translate the, and I hope I'll be able to soon publish the works of Faustus of Riez with, from my standpoint, a very important caution about don't trust this work for theology, but because I strongly disagree with it.
Are you translating Faustus's De Grazia, or because I have also
on the
been
Holy Spirit? And also, also all his letters and one sermon, a bunch of his sermons and stuff like that. So whatever I can find.
I've also been working on a translation. That's great.
Well, if what I have is helpful to you, great. And if not, obviously, please feel free to ignore it. But in any event, I do think that's important. When I read what Cassian wrote in this conference, I think there's a reason why he's attributed the view he's attributed, and that's sentences like this pair. The first one is, for if we say that the beginning of free will is in our own power, what about Paul the persecutor? What about Matthew the publican, of whom one was drawn to salvation while eager for bloodshed and the punishment of the innocent, the other for violence and rapine? He was a tax collector. That's what publican refers to, and not a nice guy. So the second sentence is this: but if we say that the beginning of our free will is always due to the inspiration of the grace of God, what about the faith of Zacchaeus? Or what are we to say of the goodness of the thief on the cross, who, by their own desires, brought violence to bear on the kingdom of heaven, and so prevented the special leadings of their vocation? In other words, by prevented here, I'm taking this in the older sense of prevene, meaning coming before the special leadings of the vocation. So I see that as it's hard to interpret that as not meaning that he sees Zacchaeus and the thief on the cross coming of their own volition before grace, as distinct from Paul, where it's the other way around.
So would you
Can I-
guys say that it seems that Cassian is sort of vacillating back and forth between his one position?
So,
Then
yeah.
it seems as though he's like, well, maybe free will can come first. Maybe I can approach, God first.
Just to be
You know
clear,
what I mean?
so Cassian, to be clear, part of the confusion arises because Cassian's Conferences is not directly a theological treatise. It's passing on the teaching of the Egyptian desert fathers for monks on how to overcome sin and even just live in Roman Gaul. It's sort of a translation of Egyptian desert teachings. Nevertheless, we do come across these passages on grace and free will. So how do we understand these things? I argue that Cassian holds to a concurrent model of grace, that it's both free will and the grace of God. His conclusion in Conference 13 lends to that. And regarding these examples that Frank has mentioned, Cassian writes, but let no one imagine that we have brought forward these instances to try to make out that the chief share in our salvation rests with our faith, according to the profane notion of some who attribute everything to free will. That's a knock against Pelagianism, and lay down that the grace of God is dispensed in accordance with the desert of each man. Right? That's Pelagianism, right? Meritorious grace. But we plainly assert our unconditional opinion that the grace of God is superabounding and sometimes overflows the narrow limits of man's lack of faith. So he clarifies what he means with these examples. That's why you've got to read all of Conference 13 so you can see that.
All right, thank you for that. Here's a final question from the audience. Then I'll have a question at the end, and then we'll close it out from there. This is for Turretin fan. Did Cassian consistently speak of semi-Pelagianism? Having read his work myself, I appreciate an honest answer.
Okay. Did he consistently speak in semi-Pelagianism? So, as Dr. Yaris just mentioned, the focus of this work wasn't to be part of the Pelagian controversy extended or something like that. Although the beginning of this chapter says, and so these are somehow mixed up and indiscriminately confused, so that among many persons, which depends on the others, involved in great questionings. So there is some, there's some attempt to educate in a situation where he thinks there's a lot of people who are confused about the subject. But it's not let's say, the primary focus of the conferences. They're more for guidance of, I think their guidance of the monastic life is the primary focus. To say, did he consistently speak in semi-Pelagianism? First of all, the label is not a label he would have liked, because he didn't like Pelagius, as Dr. Yaris just pointed out. When he says we don't assign the chief role to free will, that's a criticism of the view attributed to Pelagius. Whether or not Pelagius actually held it is, something we already hinted at. He doesn't like Pelagius. He wouldn't want to be called a Pelagian. I don't think he'd like semi-Pelagian either. However, I'm not aware of something where he later changes his mind. Like Augustine, we talked about how early Augustine has some terminology that sounds a bit semi-Pelagian. And I think it might even be reasonable to call his early position semi-Pelagian. But in any event, the later Augustine corrected that, improved his position, and took a new position that was a better and more fundamentally biblical position. But I don't see that with Cassian, that there's some evolution of his view. That said, I have not studied this for thousands of hours, and perhaps Dr. Yaris is a better person to answer whether or not Cassian's consistent on this point or changes over time. I think his conferences are, I can't think of a better source for his discussion on that. And that's, largely everyone goes to this conference and even to this chapter for material to try to put him on one side or the other of the debate.
All right, Dr. Kurt?
Yeah, so did he consistently speak in semi-Pelagianism? I mean, is that a language? Does the questioner mean in semi-Pelagian terms? As Frank pointed out, Cassian certainly would have rejected the label. He would have rejected any affiliation with Pelagius, calls him a heretic. Cassian's the only Western writer to write a work against Nestorianism, and in the first couple of chapters, he calls Pelagius a heretic. So that's clear and obvious. And then he takes swipes at him, as I just read for you. One, he takes a swipe at him in Conference 13, and elsewhere there are swipes against people who attribute everything to free will. So that's a knock against Pelagianism. So again, the term he never would have accepted. And again, I think this term really struggles from being theologically useful because it's just so broad that, as we discussed already. So the answer is no. He didn't speak in semi-Pelagianism. He didn't advocate for semi-Pelagian views, even based on how I have defined semi-Pelagianism with the systematic theology dictionaries.
All right, cool. So my question that I have is not necessarily it's provisionism, semi-Pelagianism. I just want to get you guys' thoughts on a concern that I have with provisionism. One of my concerns is that it seems to be this idea of it almost seems like those who are not accepted in Calvinism, those who are not accepted in Arminianism, come over to provisionism. We'll accept you. You know what I mean? It almost seems like it has almost this aura of inclusivity. You know what I mean? I've actually stopped following the Soteriology 101 group page, all that. So I'm not one of those guys who are always in there, chiming in, talking, I'm not a big group guy anyway. Even with the Calvinist groups, I don't chime in on those. So I guess my thought is, it's like, it seems to me, from what I've observed, it seems to me that provisionism has this almost inclusivity that Leighton, I've never heard Leighton say anything like that, or any of the primary voices of provisionism say anything like that. But just the impression that I get, I would like the idea of free grace. You know what I mean? Like free grace would be something I would just shudder at. No, I don't think it's biblical. I actually think it's heretical. So would provisionism accept someone who holds the free grace in it? You know what I mean? So is there any bounds? Clamps to say, this is not going to go. You know what I mean? This is not going to fly. Not in the understanding of provisionism. You know what I mean? I hope if y'all understand my question right, that's one of my concerns, and I observe that. Where does it stop? This idea of you're accepted into provisionism. I guess it's my question there. I hope my question doesn't come off as brass or hard, but it's a real sincere question that I've thought about. And I'm like, where does the wall stop? And say, okay, not that. You know what I mean? I don't know who wants to take the question first, but that was my concern.
I could take it first. I think your concern sort of touches on what we've talked about here, that it is so broad. Looking at the provide acrostic, that I would say that is your marker for what qualifies as provisionism and what doesn't. So looking at the P, for example, people sin, which separates all from fellowship with God, therefore divine provision became necessary. Well, if you are a full-fledged Pelagian, you would disagree with that. You would think that, hey, some people don't sin, and therefore they're not separated, and a divine provision isn't necessary for those people. So, that would be a point of how the provide acrostic does give you those fence boundaries for what is good for provisionism and what's not. As I previously stated, I think this is also a weakness for provisionism because it is so broad as it's stated.
I don't know anybody who's ever believed that, and I think Kurt knows that. There's nobody who's ever affirmed what he just called Pelagianism that I know of.
Yeah, no.
I think it needs revision to further distinguish those points where they disagree.
Jordan, any thoughts?
It does seem to attract people who don't want to be part of Calvinism or Arminianism, although I would think many many Arminians would be okay with the very broad wording of the provide acronym, if that's or it's ambiguous enough on its own that it could be interpreted in some Arminian way. But I think ultimately there does tend to be a problem that the focus of Soteriology 101, and you notice that the graphic with the logo even has Soteriology 101 like in the corner of the logo. And you'll notice that there in that logo, it says, "Is Calvinism correct?" That's part of the logo in the corner of the Provisionism graphic. And that seems to be the focus of Soteriology 101, is kind of being anti-Calvinist, trying to oppose Calvinism. And this is kind of drafted in a way that's, I think, designed to try to unify the opposition to Calvinism or something like that. And the result is that it attracts people who don't even have an orthodox view of God, like denying God's general omniscience, or that kind of idea is okay within this concept, because someone who denies that God exhaustively knows the future can hold to all of these provide points and therefore be a provisionist. And that's from my standpoint, it's not a helpful flag to fly. And also, I do think that Leighton has an outsized influence on the Provisionism. It's not a trademark per se of his group, but if you put it in the search engine, you can guess which site's going to come up as your first hit on Provisionism. It's not going to be some random person who has once in a while called himself a provisionist. It's going to be Soteriology 101. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. I appreciate you guys, man. I know my question probably, I know some folks in the chat, and because over on Warren McGrew's channel, they're like doing a debate watch live right now. So I'm sure over there they're like, "Oh my goodness, Kimberly Martin asked that question." Oh, but it's okay. It's fine. I want those kind of questions to be asked, and I think it'll be fun for those guys to dive into those type of questions. But nonetheless, I appreciate you guys for coming on, and this was a fantastic debate, one of my favorite debates actually, because I appreciate you guys' decorum and the way you guys communicated, and I love the history behind all this. That is so heartwarming.
Well, it looks like the debate is winding down, and I'm gonna go ahead and take that off the screen there. Yeah, I mean, I think some of Kurt's answers were perhaps more geared towards debate tactics, and I like some of his answers, and some of the others I objected to. I think Marlon was trying to lump every heretic that wasn't a Calvinist under the banner of Provisionism, and I think the term of Pelagianism was so ill-defined, but I think Kurt did a good job showing that it was an amorphous term that's just designed to be a pejorative and weaponized by anyone you perceive as being a little to the left of you.
Right.
What were your thoughts, Leighton?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the fact that Kurt doesn't call himself, a provisionist, makes it, a little bit of a quandary, just because you can't nail that Jello to a wall. And so, he can just squirm away from whatever accusation that Tertullian claims, because he can just say, well, yeah, I agree with you. It's a nebulous term, or it's too broad, or it's too open, or whatever, which is exactly the same thing you could say about any of the acronyms that have been created over theological history from systematic theologians. They're not meant to be perfectly succinct. That's why they're acronyms instead of, detailed statements of faith with every single, theological term defined and all that kind of stuff. It's meant to be a broad acronym that yes, is to some degree reactionary to Calvinistic theology. I mean, obviously, it's like we're pro God's love and provision for all people. So thereby, we're by necessity anti anything that stands against God's love and provision for all people, which would be, i.e., Calvinism. So, Calvinists are the only group out there who are saying that God doesn't love and provide for everybody. Arminians disagree with that. Provisionists disagree with that. Roman Catholics disagree with that. Anglicans disagree with that. I mean, all the other groups disagree with that except for Calvinists. So, yeah, I mean, that broader term, open theists disagree with that. Molinists disagree with that. So, yeah, we all fit on the broader term of being not a Calvinist and thus a provisionist in that God provides for everybody, if that's the broader scope of that term. Now, when you get into traditional Southern Baptists and you get into once saved, always saved, eternal security issues, the debates over the nuances of original sin and the inherited guilt and inability, and get into the nuances of the different views of atonement and how those are defined, and illuminating grace versus irresistible or prevenient grace and all those kinds of things, then yeah, you get into a more like Kurt rightly suggested, there are subsets of a more broader provisionist tent that we're going to have various views within of the nature of what grace is. And what's so interesting to me about that, Warren, is that it's like it's grace only if God does something later. It can't be grace if it's the way he created us. It can't be grace if it's the way he designed it. It only can be grace is if it somehow countervails that which he designed. So it has to be God designed you to be X and then graciously works to make you into Y, and then it can be called grace. It can't be that he just graciously created you to be Y, because that wouldn't really be grace. Who says? Who are you, oh man, to say what God considers to be gracious or not? It's just so arbitrary.
It's that view that God has created you pre-programmed to believe lies, as John MacArthur said. So therefore you need his grace later. And if you don't affirm this ontological inability that God is effectually responsible for all evil and inability to understand, then you're denying his grace, because we put that at the tail end. Whereas we're saying, no, God was gracious when he fine-tuned the universe. I mean, you get into apologetics. God was gracious when he gave us, taste buds that we could enjoy eating. Can you imagine a world where we had to eat and it was boring and everything tasted like cardboard? There's so many different levels of God's grace that he shows us, and he creates us in his image and likeness with our God-given faculties and ability to make sense of reality and pursue truth and employ logic and reason and discernment, that we can grow and mature. And, all of these things, the thumbprint of God on our conscience, our intuition, that God-given intuition, absolute morality, our ability to know the difference between right and wrong that God puts on everyone. All of these are manifestations of God's grace. And then you say, well, then because we go astray into sin and we get hard-hearted, God comes again graciously with the gospel and with his love and display of selflessness on the cross, and through the people that he has called into ministry, and he speaks through and empowers and calls into ministry. That's gracious as well. And we're saying he's gracious here, he's gracious there, there's God's grace here. And they go, no. You're denying the grace because you're refusing to say that he created us pre-programmed for deception. You're denying grace because you're denying total inability. And I think that's
right. You have to have God marring the clay in order for him to graciously correct the clay that he marred.
Yeah.
You can't have it where men freely choose to go astray and mar themselves, so as God graciously providing a means for that marred clay to be redeemed. You can't have that, because then man get all the credit and all the glory. God doesn't get any glory or the credit, and it becomes this this man supremacy and man-centeredness and all of these kinds of accusations that you bring, all on the basis of God basically being blamed for the sin of man. Now, they would never come out and say God's blamed for the sin of man, but their theology blames God for the sin of man, and by divine decree. And that's the problem with that kind of way of teaching and way of thinking, because it blames man. It blames God, not man, for unbelief.
Yeah, Andrew says that's called Munchausen by proxy, where the parent will actually make their children sick so they can get attention. Oh, look at my sick child, and I'm taking care of them, and I'm helping them. And we rightly...
Well, it's the fireman setting the fire and then running in to rescue everybody so he gets all the glory for all the rescues. It's the movie that we talked about, the Incredibles. It's the little kid that pretends to attack the world so he can come in and be the superhero that rescues the world. It makes God look duplicitous. It makes God look like he's a narcissist that's just trying to destroy the world with his left hand, hiddenly, while saving it with his right hand and expecting everybody to just go, whoa, wow, whoa, what awesome God he is. Instead of recognizing that, no, God has created a world with creatures who are able to make free choices. And that he is rescuing us from our decisions and our choices. He's not rescuing us from his own determinations. He's not cleaning up his own messes here, you know?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, the starting premise of the Augustinian position it seems to me to be diametrically opposed to reality and Christian orthodoxy, and you can mark that progression across the development of various doctrines in church history. And I mean, I've been convinced by my studies, but I think that what happens is as you get into, I mean, you're at a football game, right? It's my team versus your team, and it's like rah 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 rah. Well, why are we rooting? Well, because we all came from the same hometown, right? Well, why should I root for the team that comes from where I live versus the team over there? What is it fundamentally about this team that makes me want to root for them? Well, I have a connection to them. And so if you were raised in Augustinianism or you come into Augustinianism, a lot of times you find yourself defending it just due to familiarity, this familial type of relationship. Like your son's on the football team, you root for that team. That's understandable. Well, it almost starts to feel like, I'm on that team Augustine. I gotta root for that. But I think when people stop and they actually consider the scriptures and they use reason, I know sometimes that's in opposition to Calvinism, but when they use reason, they study church history, they start to see, oh, this is extremely problematic. And I was curious to see how the debate was going to progress. I knew it was going to come down to definitions. I knew that Kurt didn't identify as a provisionist. I identify as big tent provisionist. There's certain things in the anachronist, the acrostic that I go, but big tent provisionist is everybody who doesn't affirm the L. If you believe God loved everybody, if you believe he made a means of saving everyone, then you're a big tent provisionist. I have friends in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they're like, yeah, I'm a big tent provisionist. They're not traditionalist Southern Baptists, but they're big tent provisionists because they recognize God's universal love for all people.
Well, and who has given us a great example of doing that, if not Together for the Gospel movement, the Calvinists? I mean, they've got Paleo Baptists, Credo Baptists, they've got all kinds of charismatic versus non-charismatic, and all of them who are together for what? Calvinism. They affirm the basic tenets of Calvinism. Not all of them hold to every point of Calvinism, but the basic tenets of what Calvinists basically hold to. And they do huge seminars and conferences and book sales and have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of followers around the Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel, Grace to You Ministries, Linganmere Ministries, Desiring God Ministries, and Got Questions, all of them surrounding the Calvinistic soteriology. And then they have the audacity to criticize us over here for ignoring a few of our philosophical differences over omniscience or over, some of the means of grace, of the ways in which the means of grace, as if we can't have intramural discussions over eternal security and these kinds of issues too. I mean, come on.
I mean, Leighton, you've got James White going to the G3 conference after he's spoken up and he's starting to question some classical theism entailments, and yet he's going to go along with these guys that are hardcore classical theists. They differ on theonomy, they differ on eschatology, they differ on their lapsarian views. There's some major differences in that. Major differences. Go back 300 years ago, 400 or 500 years ago, they would kill each other over these differences, but they're together for Calvinism. They're, that they call it the gospel, but they're together for Calvinism. And you're right. I think coming in and going, oh, well, look, these guys are all affirming God's universal love and provision for everyone. So there's something that we should condemn there, because they're rallying around the gospel, the true gospel. I think it's silly to call that sort of a criticism.
At least we're not calling uniquely what we hold to as the gospel. At least we're saying we're rallying around God's provision for all, or God's love for all. At least we're being at least that cordial, not to just call it the gospel, as if the Calvinists don't believe the gospel at all. So if anything, we're being more, specific and more defined than what the Calvinists are being in their big tent, together for the gospel, calling the gospel basically a renewal of Calvinism is what the true gospel is in that worldview. And so it just falls kind of on deaf ears to me when I hear all these criticisms. It's just like the criticism of, oh, Leighton, you misrepresent us. You just never represent, us Calvinists very well. Okay, find me the leading Calvinist who's doing a third, or I'll even give you, a fourth of what I have done in striving to properly represent Calvinists. Find me a leading, notable Calvinistic source who's doing even a fourth of what I've strived to do on my broadcast to represent the other side rightly. And then you can have something to critique me about with my representation. But they're not even trying to represent us rightly.
And you could tell the debate was really, it was like, is Provisionism semi-Pelagianism? That's what it was marketed as. But the debate really was, is Leighton Flowers a Pelagian? And that's really where they wanted that debate to go. I think on the part of Turretin fan, that's really where he wanted to go. He wanted to hang his hat on Leighton Flowers being a Pelagian. And so it's like, it's not a matter of, a percentage of like agreement with Pelagius. It's not a percentage of semi-Pelagian. It's not the historical definition. It seems to be like, well, I want this thing that I've got in my hand stinks, and I just really want to smear you with it. And that was kind of how
it's almost like if I can find something that Pelagius believed that Leighton also believes, then I've won my point. The problem with that is one, you can find things that Pelagius thought that every single Calvinist, and like he even talked about James White, believes in credo baptism versus pedio baptism. Okay, he's a semi-Pelagian in his view of baptism. He doesn't believe in baptismal regeneration of infants, which was a big part of that debate between Pelagius and Augustine. Is that if you hold to credo baptism like all Baptists do, including James White, then you are a semi-Pelagian in that debate, because you agree with him on one of the most major points of that whole debate during the 5th century. And a lot of people, they just seem to ignore that as if it has nothing to do with it. But it's one of the major cruxes of why Augustine takes his seminal view and the necessity of the baptismal waters of the baby to become regenerate, to become born again, to become regenerate, to be washed. The necessity of that was because of his belief in that view of original sin. And a lot of Baptist Calvinists don't even recognize that, or don't want to look at it, because it proves their position to be, flawed to begin with, or at least the origins of their position to be flawed.
Yeah, I mean, they're affirming this anthropology, but then they're inconsistent in its historical application. Matthew wants to know. He said, "Hey, how's your son doing in the football game?"
He's doing well. He's playing outside linebacker, but he's on junior varsity, so he already played earlier. When they first started, he was playing every play. Now it's varsity, and they're just putting the junior varsity in on occasion. So he's only playing every so often. That's why you'll see me every once in a while. I'll kind of mute it, turn it off when he's out in the field. He's more interested in the game at that point.
Yeah. And yeah, Jacob goes, "Hey, wait a minute! You actually have Leighton Flowers here?" He's like, "This is pretty cool." Yeah, so Leighton joined us at the start, but he's at his son's football game, so he's been speaking up. And we tried not to. Yes, cool shot. We tried not to talk over the guys too much during the debate. You know, we added a little bit of commentary, an objection here or there, clarification here or there, but we really tried to give them the time to talk. But yeah, it seemed like not the debate that I'd hoped it would be. I think in many areas Kurt performed really well, and I think in those areas where he saw an out from a debate tactic, I think he took it.
Yeah, Kurt did well to point out some of the major issues. I think he made some really strong points.
Yeah,
And overall, I think he obviously won the discussion, and I would say that obviously, but it like he said a dozen times throughout the debate, it's kind of a useless term. That becomes the whole thing. Is that it's almost it really is almost, even when I saw the debate and the announcement for it, my immediate reaction was go, oh my gosh, who cares? Just like,
yeah.
and my name was mentioned more than anybody else's in the world, and I'm saying who cares? That really shows you how irrelevant that topic even is, because it really doesn't matter, because it's like it really is the whole issue of who's defining the term. And what does that term mean to the person who's defining it? And it's different for every. It's so relative. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Peter Fox says he appreciates how far you go to assume the best intentions and present Calvinists in the most charitable way possible. He's thanking you for doing that. I'm looking here, just seeing if we've got any other questions along the way. Here's something from Ethan. Ethan says, I think it's time for provisionism to define what's orthodox for provisionists on the doctrine of God, nature of faith, and atonement. Again, I mean, if you're talking big tent provisionism, or you're talking Southern Baptist traditionalist, I mean, I think the Southern Baptist traditionalist has nailed down a lot of this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you have all different kinds of Calvinistic theologians who believe relatively different issues regarding all different manners of theology. And they typically are willing to overlook those differences. Now, I say that there are intramural debates, obviously, with Calvinists all the time. Over complementarianism, for example, or use of alcohol and all kinds of baptism we already mentioned. Even the doctrine of God, or original sin, or original guilt. There's debates among Calvinists on those issues. Limited atonement is a huge debate among Reformed theologians. So where is the voice crying in the wilderness? When are the Calvinists going to define this doctrine and make everybody stick to it? Why? Why? Who's saying that we have to do that? This is a particular soteriological discussion, and this particular discussion has to do with God's love and provision for all people. That's what it has to do with. And it only muddies the water if Leighton Flowers, start stepping in and going, okay, you need to be a complementarian, or at least a soft complementarian, to be a provisionist. Because otherwise, if you're an egalitarian provisionist, then I'm not going to really call you a provisionist. What does egalitarianism has anything to do with provisionism? Yeah. It's a different topic. Why would I exclude egalitarians from being provisionists just because I'm not an egalitarian? You know what I mean? It's just it just seems like a way of narrowing a field more and more and more and more and more. And that's why I get so much in trouble, because I platform Warren McGrews, who has a different.
See, if you didn't bring me on your channel, nobody would hate you. Everybody would have accepted. But I'm the culprit. Yeah. See, so they're calling you semi-Pelagian, and they're saying your association with me is proof of it. So,
Well, yeah, and it's just like I have just as many friends who are Molinists and just as many friends who are determinists in other words, I get along with all of you philosophers. I get along with all of the philosophical views with regard to whether you're a determinist, whether you're a provisionist, a Molinist, or whether you're a dynamic open theist, whatever. I get along with all of y'all because I see that as a philosophical secondary issue.
And I do as well. I just finished recording an interview earlier this week with Tim Stratton. That's going to be edited and coming out soon. But one of the things he said, look, I'm focused on blowing the ship up of exhaustive divine determinism. And he's like, and I've got simple foreknowledge guys in the ship next to me. I've got dynamic omniscience guys in the ship right there next to them. And we're going after exhaustive divine determinism because it's just not biblical. And he said, if I end up blowing up my ship, one of these guys has got to be sound. I'm going to get in with them, And
well,
he's like, let's go together.
I was talking to Tim Stratton, who's a big time Molinist, written a book on the subject, has the endorsement of William Lane Craig, the most notable modern day Molinist there is. And he's told me right out, if he got proof, Molinism wasn't true, that he would rather jump ship to the dynamic perspective than to EDD any day of the week.
Oh yeah.
Because EDD has way more philosophical and theological problems than does the dynamic perspective from his perspective.
I think we lost Leighton. Let's see. Maybe we can get him back. It was an interesting debate. I liked. I'll keep an eye out, and if Leighton comes back in, I'll bring him in. Y'all don't go anywhere. It's just me. Please don't unsubscribe. But it was an interesting debate. I think Kurt made some really strong points. I think if we're talking about how to flow a debate, which is something that I'm trying to get better at, he laid out his 3 points at the beginning of the debate, and then in his rebuttal, he again hammered those 3 points. During the cross-examination, he redirected to those 3 points. And then in his close, he again reaffirmed those 3 points. And I didn't really see Turretin fan really refuting or negating those main claims that Kurt was making. So I think clearly, and I'm a big tent provisionist. I don't subscribe to some of the more nuanced positions there. So I have a little bit of skin in the game. I'm friends with Leighton. I'm going to support my friend. But I think Kurt really pulled a win here in a big way. But it was definitional. So if you come to the debate and you're going, well, I'm going to affirm a Calvinistic perspective, then you're going to be more inclined to assume those definitions that Turretin fan was giving. But I don't think that he presented a convincing argument here. Oh, and I see we've got Chris Harris in the chat with us. Hey, man, that's awesome. Thank you for supporting the channel. Really appreciate the love. Let's look here. We've got a quote here, or a comment here from Matthew Wichman. He says, "It blows my mind that some Arminians are more focused on defending the aardvark than taking down the ulip, the elephant." That's a reference to a statement I made on Leighton's program a few months ago. But people need to get together and realize that I think just how toxic and dangerous Calvinism is to the soul. Again, that's the ism. You can swallow the poison pill, and I'll still love you, and I'll see it as sick and something that needs help. I don't make it salvific. If you're affirming the doctrines of grace, somehow you're automatically not a Christian. But I think you're in deep peril. So I'm going to do my best to come in there and shake some sense into you in love. Looking through the comments here, let's see what we've got. I'm just looking here, guys. I hate dead air. I hate radio silence. So I'm over here looking, and reading, and as I'm doing that, I'm going, I've let there be too long of a pause. I don't know. Maybe it's my days back when I was in my early 20s, late teens. I was in radio, and you just don't have dead air. And so now when there's like a silent space on here, I feel obligated to say something. I don't care if it's an or an or just stop and talk to the camera like I'm doing now. Like I feel like this obligation just to provide content, and that can get you in trouble, which is why I don't put out a whole lot of videos. I try not to go beyond my my skill set or my area of study. Andrew says, I'm very thankful you brought on Warren. Oh, you're saying you're thankful that that Leighton is giving me an unabashed endorsement of every belief that I have without any disagreement, platforming me and basically telling me I'm going to take over the Soteriology 101 broadcast after he retires. I think that's what you were saying. Let's see. Yeah, no, I knew what you meant. Yeah. No, you know what, man? Hey, I love my Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. I disagree on some issues like Marianology, depending on how you want to describe your icons and praying to the saints. I think there's a path that I can affirm. My Protestant skin still kind of crawls on some of this stuff. But there's a lot with the doctrines and stuff there that I just go, ooh, it's beautiful. I love it. I'm not, there's still some stuff that keeps me from being able to go into the Eastern Church. I love those guys. But I think I'm called to just be a theological mutt, and anyone who professes faith in Christ, I'll just consider to be a brother. And as I'm following Christ, I'm doing my best, but I don't use these labels as salvific. If you come to faith in Christ as a Roman Catholic, right, you're going to have doctrinal issues. If you come to faith as a Eastern Orthodox, you're going to have some doctrinal issues. If you come to faith as a Protestant, an Anabaptist, you're going to have some doctrinal issues, because when we come to faith in Christ, none of us have perfect doctrine. This is one of the things I love about the East, is that they recognize that unlike the West, it's not knowledge that saves, like meaning memorization. It's not like I have this book and I have memorized it, or I affirm this book exists, therefore I'm saved. But it's more of a relationship, a love, a following, a reciprocity. God loves us, I love him. And that's one of the things I love about the East, is that focus on the relational aspect of it. But I think often we tend to discount people who are in a different theological camp over those differences. We say, well, your Marian dogma is so offensive that your faith in Christ is worthless, or your views on baptism are so egregious that your faith in Christ is worthless. And I think when we do that, we miss the heart of the gospel. We miss the person of who Christ is, and the realization that we're works in progress, and no one comes to faith with perfect understanding. But the more that we follow him, we get into that theosis, that transformation and becoming more and more like him. And so wherever someone is professing faith in Christ, I'm going to consider you a brother. If you're a Calvinist and you're professing faith in Christ, I'm going to consider you a brother. Chris Harris does not consider me a brother. He considers me a wolf. I don't know if the guy is saved or not. I know Calvinism is dangerous. I believe some of his behavior is questionable. But if he professes faith in Christ, then I'm going to trust that he knows the Lord, and the Lord's going to work that out in his life. He's going to come around and go, oh, we're going to get in heaven. He's going to be, Warren, you're here. Oh, that was awkward. Let's see. Here we go. Here's some tough questions. Ethan, you got a question for Leighton, and I'll put this on the screen. It's a difficult one. And I think Leighton's silence on this is quite telling. Of course, he's not here to answer the question, right? There's a lot of times you'll get that. Well, you didn't answer my question, therefore you must affirm it. Well, he's not here to answer it. But let me see if I can answer it. Would I fellowship with a Mormon or a oneness affirming person? Uh-oh, he's here. Leighton, here's a question. Here's a question for you, sir. Ethan wants to know if you would have fellowship with a Mormon or a oneness affirming person. Those are tough questions.
Fellowship in the sense of saying that I think that they're believer, or I think that they're Christian. No, Mormonism isn't Christian. I'm assuming he'd be my oneness, those who don't affirm Christ as the divinity of Christ. And I don't believe that's a Christian doctrine either, so I wouldn't affirm them as Christians. But I would still fellowship with them in the sense that I'm sure what he means by fellowship is like Christian fellowship, which you have.
Yeah, considering them a brother or something along those lines.
Yeah, and my answer would be no, I would not consider them as a brother in that sense, if I understand the question correctly.
See, I view Mormonism as their Christology is so outside the wheelhouse of what it even means to be a Christian that I can't consider them, part of the Christian body at large. But I think they're great moral people. I think that they're in deception on their doctrines. I think they've got generally they're very good people. But I think as far as whether they're a member of the body of Christ, I think their Christology is so off base. I don't, maybe there's some weird exception out there where somebody has genuine saving faith. But I think if we're going off just Mormonism, no. Oneness, I believe they affirm the divinity of Christ, but it's more of almost like in a modalist. Of course, I'm not an expert on oneness, but I think they're more.
Yeah, that's why I was hesitating a little bit, because I wasn't sure. I've not studied, the oneness debate.
I think oneness generally affirm the divinity of Christ, but they see almost in terms of modalism. And even though I'm a Trinitarian, I also know the early laity, there were a lot of modalists. And while I affirm the Trinity is sound, I don't think that it's necessary for salvation. I mean, you can come to faith in Christ and trust him, but not know the anatomy of God.
Well, because there were a lot of Christians in the early church that, before the triune doctrines were established for what they are, there were hundreds of years before those doctrines were really mulled out. And so, if somebody has a misunderstanding of the triune nature of who God is, or something of that nature, then I'm not going to automatically just assume they can't be, or they aren't redeemed. If they're trusting in Christ for their salvation, and they have some misunderstanding of the nature of the nature of the triune God. Who doesn't have some false theological beliefs with regard to some of those complex issues? So anybody who knows me knows I'm fairly broad tint when it comes to misunderstanding of theological concepts, which gets me in trouble sometimes with some people because they want theological black and whites. They don't like the gray areas. But the older I get and the more I study these debates over the history of, theological terminologies and all the systematic theologians that have debated these issues, when you read all of the historical development, you can't help but become more gracious in the way you handle people who disagree with you. That's one of the reasons that people say, you go off to that seminary and you'll get all liberal on us. Well, no, you go off to seminary and you get educated enough to recognize that it's not black and white on every issue. Sorry, it's just not.
Well, there's this idea within certain veins of like Trinitarianism, and I'm speaking as one who affirms true Nicene Trinitarianism. But what they'll do is they'll say, if you don't affirm the Trinity, you're not saved. And then I'll respond, I'll go, what model of the Trinity is the salvific one? And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I go, well, the Filioque, the non-Filioque, the East, the West, which one's the salvific one? And they're like, oh, well, any one of them will do. And I go, well, then you just conceded the point. It's not right. Like, it's important. I think it's very important for sound Christology.
Like in the nature of omniscience. Whenever white or someone tries to pin you down on what you believe about God's knowledge, he never gets it right.
Mm-mm.
you're always just saying, no, I affirm God knows all possible contingencies, this and this or whatever, when he's just trying to accuse you of not knowing that or not believing that he knows that. And so that's one of the reasons that I've become more gracious towards people who have a various views on that issue, because once I heard them out, I go, oh, I had oversimplified that to say, God's, kind of like us in the sense that he's kind of learning along with us what's happening, and he doesn't have any real idea what's coming up, in the future. And once I learned that that's not really what most dynamic guys believe, then I was like, oh, okay, well, what they're saying is actually a lot more reasonable than what they're being accused of saying.
Yeah, I see some overlap. Like I'll talk with my Molinist friends, and they're like, I can affirm a lot of what you're saying, Warren. Or I'll talk with my simple foreknowledge guys, and they're like, I can affirm a lot of what you're saying. And it's just where, you get into that exhaustive divine decree and an eternally settled future world. And then you go, well, I can't get on board with that. And I think there's a lot of agreement and overlap there. But when I first heard about open views, I thought that was polytheism. So like I was completely stupid and ignorant of that position. And I was like, oh no, I condemn open theism. It's only Jesus, he's the only one that can save us. People are like, Warren, do you know what you're talking about? And I'm like, I don't.
It's not. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's changed only a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Chris Harris is in the chat, so he'll say no, not much. But I'm looking through here through the chat.
And you may see me drop off here again as soon as I'm waiting on my son. He's supposed to be coming out of the locker room here, and once he heading this way, I'll probably jump off so I can spend my ride home with him. But
well, our mutual friend over at Grace Mercy Wrath said that you were raptured. He thought that's what happened. The rest of us were sticking around. So we were getting worried.
My iPhone was raptured from its power. That's if that's what you want to call rapture. But yeah, I'm sitting out here in the middle of a parking lot, and that's the opposing team. They're loading up on the bus there, if you can see that. And then I'm waiting for my son to come out of that field house over there, and fun dad duties. Good stuff.
Yeah. Now, you have how many children?
4. This is my youngest, Caden. He's 16.
Is this the one that you said you knew was totally depraved, or was that the other child?
Yeah, the only one that's really totally depraved. The other ones are partially depraved.
Oh man.
My daughter is just barely depraved. She's an angel. She was born an angel.
See, I was telling the guys at the beginning, I said, I hate dead air and radio silence. And, when I'm over here reading the comments, I don't know if you feel this way when you're on your program, but I'll be reading the comments and realize I'm not saying anything.
Yeah.
And I feel a burden to do something. Telcor said that I need to break into song to avoid dead air.
You need to have a little music button. Like you just push the button, almost like your idol killer button. You just have like an elevator music button.
Oh yeah, well, I've got this with me.
It is a foreign religion.
You just keep pushing that over and over and over while you read the comments if you want. That way you're giving Calvinists, their due. You're letting them speak because they don't really say much more than what you have them, the content of their rebukes are pretty much summed up there in your in that button. So, good way to have them represented while you're still reading,
Yeah, I mean, if you've heard one James White rebuttal, you've heard them all. Yeah, it's great stuff.
Yeah, very, very good, very deep.
Now, let me ask you this: have y'all settled on the debate? Is that still in the works? Has that been?
Evan, I think it's Evan, that's the pastor there in the Lutheran church down in Houston that hosts those debates, and he was emailing with both of us, and we finally agreed on the topic of does John 6:44 support unconditional election, and we were deciding on a date, and we kept I couldn't do early February, and he couldn't do late February, and so we were just missing each other on dates, and so he kind of threw up his hands, kind of like, I guess we're not going to find a date. So that's been the issue right now, is just finding a date that works for both of us. But I just think it's interesting that Calvinists insist on debating their major proof texts, but they won't have a debate over the text that affirm more of our position. My son's coming, so
I'll let you go. I think what we'll do is we're gonna go ahead and shut this down.
I'll let y'all meet my totally depraved son, Caden.
Hey guys.
Hey man, that's awesome.
I mean, in just a minute. We'll talk to you later, brother.
Have a good one, guys. Thanks so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, it was a fun evening. Thank you for joining me and Leighton and Leighton's youngest son there towards the end. I really, like I said, I enjoyed a lot of Kurt's arguments. I think he presented a better case. I see why on some of the things where he would go, well, it's a little undefined. I might agree with you. It's a little, and I think there was some legitimate justification in him saying that as well. I think it really helped for debate purposes. But I think overall he flowed the debate better. I think he made better arguments. But it just seems to be pejorative. You're Pelagian. You're semi-Pelagian. You're an idiot. You're kind of an idiot. Like it doesn't have any real merit. It's become an insult. It's just a club. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate y'all. Until next time, God bless. We'll see you again.
The only way to get there was to float through the terrifying void between us.